one of those bipartisan efforts will be on the floor of the House today, the First Step Act, and I hope that is just the first step in what is badly needed criminal justice reform in our country, and addressing major parts of prison reform and sentencing reform are a great part of that. So thank you for your kind words, and I'll now begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. When President Obama's Department of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, first testified in front of this committee, I told him that he was not responsible for the dangerous and irresponsible decisions made by DHS before he was sworn in. And I told him that we could only hope that he would bring back a level of adult responsibility to the enforcement of our immigration laws. The same rings true today. The current secretary is not responsible for the actions of her predecessors, but she carries the burden of reversing the course of years of implemented policies that flagrantly disregarded and hindered the rule of law in the United States immigration system. She carries the burden of ensuring that immigration enforcement is on track and that immigration benefits are issued only to those eligible to receive them. She carries the burden of ensuring that U.S. immigration law and policy is workable and that it benefits America. Historically, our immigration laws and policy have been written to balance national security with humanitarian generosity and meeting the workforce needs of a fluctuating economy. Sometimes the laws and policies need to be updated to respond to situations that have arisen over time. That is the case with our asylum laws, with our laws governing inadmissible and removable aliens, and our laws governing detention of aliens, and with our laws governing legal immigration, among many others. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of many of us in Congress, we have not been able to pass legislation to change those laws. And unfortunately, over the last 2 years, nearly every time DHS has attempted to enforce the immigration laws as they were written by Congress, or to make sure that their policies adhere to those laws, the agency has been thwarted by politicians who want this to remain a political issue, the open borders lobby, the biased media, and activist judges on federal courts. Even the Obama administration had problems with activist courts, which was apparent when they challenged the ruling a Central District of California judge in the Flores settlement case. So DHS is left to deal with the repercussions. The number of apprehensions of illegal aliens between the ports of entry along the southwest U.S. border is increasing exponentially. During fiscal year 2018, 396,579 aliens were apprehended entering the U.S. illegally between southwest border ports of entry. This trend is continuing into fiscal year 2019, with 51,000 such aliens apprehended in October and 51,856 apprehended in November. These numbers include increases in family units as well as unaccompanied alien children. At the same time, DHS is faced with ever-increasing violence and lawlessness at the southwest border. One need look no further than the explosive events of November 25, when the San Ysidro port of entry had to be shut down to prevent the port from being overrun by a rush of migrants associated with the caravan from Central America. For weeks, we were told by the Open Borders lobby and by much of the media that the thousands of caravanners were peaceful and that they were fleeing violence, not seeking to invoke it. Instead, on that day, upwards of 1,000 caravanners attempted to storm the entry lanes to San Ysidro. And when they couldn't do so, they attempted to storm through the port through the southbound exit lanes. And when that failed, they began to go around to the side of the port, jump fences, and force entry. They hurled rocks, bottles, and whatever else they could use as a projectile to attack Border Patrol and other CBP officials. 4 agents were injured during the altercation. CBP officials used tear gas, as has been used many, many times in the past for crowd control, and were able to eventually turn back the vast majority of the migrants. And this is just one of the difficult and dangerous situations that the men and women of DHS encounter every day. Whether it is rescuing over 4,300 aliens last year from drowning or dehydration while they were attempting to enter the U.S. illegally, or effectively removing high-profile dangerous aliens from the U.S., or extricating trafficking victims from their abusers, the employees of DHS are to be commended. But the DHS immigration functions are much more than just enforcement related. The U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is taking seriously its responsibility to the integrity of immigration benefits and the rule of law. For instance, many immigration benefit applicants in the United States who are found ineligible for the visa or status they are seeking are now appropriately issued a notice to appear in immigration court. And the agency has issued a notice of proposed rulemaking to, for the first time ever, give regulatory clarity to the statutory requirement that aliens in the United States be able to support themselves financially. And last year, the agency naturalized over 756,000 new Americans, more than in any of the previous 5 years. I look forward to hearing from Secretary Nielsen about the Department of Homeland Security's mission regarding immigration and what we here in Congress can do to help advance that mission. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Nielsen, I'm glad to see you before our committee. I'm disappointed, however, that it has taken so long to schedule this oversight hearing. This is the first time you've appeared before this committee in over a year on the job. And your predecessor, General Kelly, never appeared at all during his tenure as Homeland Security Secretary before becoming White House Chief of Staff. Much of the Department of Homeland Security's operations fall squarely within this committee's jurisdiction, and this administration has engaged in a wide range of dramatic policy changes, yet the committee has failed to conduct any meaningful oversight until now. Moreover, members of the committee have written dozens of letters to you, many of which have received little or no substantive response. As we move into the next Congress, I want to put you and the department on notice. The time for accountability has arrived. The members of this committee have a responsibility to ask hard questions of any administration and to ensure that federal agencies are acting in accordance with the law and in the best interest of the American people. That job begins today. Foremost on our minds is the tragic death of 7-year-old Jacqueline Kalmakin while in DHS custody. It is important that we understand exactly what led to her death and what steps DHS is taking to prevent a similar tragedy from occurring. The fact that CBP does not conduct a full medical examination of people it holds in its custody when they come into its custody is outrageous, and it is a policy that should be changed today. But more broadly, this heartbreaking case also highlights the failure of the Trump administration's haphazard and chaotic immigration policies. For example, although the law expressly allows individuals to request asylum regardless of the manner of entry, this administration has repeatedly implored asylum seekers to come to ports of entry. At the same time, DHS turns away those who do come to those ports, forcing them to wait weeks or months before actually being able to file an asylum application. These conflicting messages create mass confusion and actually drive migrants to use dangerous routes, which some people suspect is the purpose of this policy. In September, the department's own Inspector General issued a report describing the impact of DHS's policies. The IG found evidence that the practice of turning away asylum seekers and, quote, limiting the volume of asylum seekers entering at ports of entry, close quote, may have increased illegal crossing attempts. One asylum seeker, quote, had been turned away 3 times by an officer on the bridge before deciding to take her chances on illegal entry. In other words, the administration's dangerous and chaotic policies have caused desperate people to use desperate means to find protection for themselves and their children. This has likely cost at least 1 life already, and it will likely cost many more unless we return to a more rational and humane policy. We must also conduct much needed and long overdue oversight over the department's disastrous family separation policy. At its most basic level, we have 3 simple questions. What made the administration think that seizing children from the arms of their parents was acceptable at any level? Under what authority and under whose direction was this done? And now, what are you doing to repair the untold damage the department has inflicted on these children and their families? Not only was this policy abhorrent and morally repugnant, It is clear that the department was either incompetent or grossly negligent in its implementation, which only compounded the trauma inflicted on innocent children and their parents. For example, DHS failed to keep sufficient records that would enable the eventual reunification of separated children with their parents. Again, this is the conclusion of the department's own Inspector General. Among other things, the IG found that DHS, quote, struggled to identify, track, and reunite families, unquote, that your agency caused confusion by providing inconsistent information to separated families, and that the department, quote, was not fully prepared to implement the administration's zero-tolerance policy or to deal with some of its after-effects, close quote. I would also ask, on what planet can a humane democratic country deport parents without giving them the opportunity to have their children with them and without maintaining records so you could identify them afterwards? The fact that this was handled so poorly and that some separated children have yet to be reunited with their parents is unacceptable. Mass kidnapping by the federal government is criminal. We recently learned that DHS piloted a family separation policy in El Paso months earlier. The fact that these issues were not identified at the time or that they were willfully ignored demonstrates a callousness and an indifference to human suffering that is simply appalling, unless it is deliberate to deter people from exercising their right to request political asylum. It is past time for a full accounting of this shameful policy. We must also look at the administration's enforcement priorities or lack thereof. Rather than prioritize for removal those who threaten public safety, as was done by past administrations, this administration has effectively chosen to prioritize everyone, and thus no one. Particularly egregious are the policy changes targeting women, children, and families. DHS, for example, ended the presumption to release pregnant women from detention, and it seeks to indefinitely detain families by overturning the Flores Settlement Agreement through rulemaking. All of this is being done despite the fact that the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and the American Academy of Family Physicians have concluded that, quote, the conditions in DHS facilities are not appropriate for pregnant women or children. Not content, close quote, not content to attack and dehumanize those who seek asylum in our country, a right guaranteed by our laws, the administration is also attacking legal immigration. It is hell-bent on stripping DACA recipients of their work permits, ending TPS protections for thousands of immigrants who have been here legally for decades, and even rescinding work authorization for the spouses of H-1B workers who have been approved for immigrant visas. DHS also has proposed to dramatically reinterpret the public charge ground for inadmissibility, which would effectively penalize individuals for receiving supplemental public benefits to which they are legally entitled. As DHS's own analysis found, it may make America sicker and poorer, and it will have a profound negative effect on the health, safety, and economic well-being of communities across America. As I stated in a comment submitted on this rule with 110 of my colleagues, the rule is an unlawful and dangerous attempt by the administration to circumvent Congress and to reduce legal immigration. The administration has been clear in its desire to cut legal immigration, especially for the family members of U.S. citizens. The President, for example, has repeatedly pushed the RAISE Act, which would cut legal immigration in half. After failing to get that bill through Congress, the administration is now seeking to accomplish its goals by creating obstacles for individuals legally seeking to come to this country. The Trump administration, including DHS under your watch, has launched a relentless attack against immigrants of all stripes. Although your department has evaded meaningful oversight until now, you can be sure that beginning in January, this committee intends to do its job in a fair but firm manner. The time for zero accountability is over, and we are determined to ensure that the department's policies and practices are aligned with the laws and with the values of this nation. Thank you again, Secretary Nielsen, for appearing before the committee today. I look forward to a substantive dialogue with you on these critical matters. Now I yield back the balance of my time.
The committee will stand in recess. When we return after this vote series, we will hear from Secretary Nielsen. Thank you. The committee stands in recess.
territory pending an immigration proceeding. Arriving, that is just for contiguous. So again, arriving from, in case of an alien arriving from Mexico or Canada.
We have specific statutes that, when there's an exception to rewrite your first question, given the statement
There appears to be.
that she's about to make.
The committee will reconvene. We welcome our distinguished witness. And Madam Secretary, if you would please rise, I'll begin by swearing you in. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. Our only witness today is the Honorable Kirstjen M. Nielsen. Secretary Nielsen was sworn in as the 6th Secretary of Homeland Security on December 6, 2017. Secretary Nielsen is the first former Department of Homeland Security employee to become the Secretary. And your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety, and we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. And to help you stay within that time, there's a timing light on your table. It switches from green to yellow when you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. Thank you, and you may begin.
Well, good morning, Chairman Goodlatte, Ranking Member Nadler, and all the distinguished members of the committee. Before we begin, I want to take a minute to thank the Chairman for his service to our country and for supporting our nation's frontline defenders at DHS and beyond. Sir, you have the thanks of the entire Department of Homeland Security. We wish you well in your retirement from Congress. Our department has many missions, and our people work tirelessly each day and around the clock to strengthen the safety and security of the American people against terrorists, transnational criminals, hackers, rogue nation states, natural disasters, and more. I applaud them for their extraordinary vigilance in protecting us all from persistent and emerging threats. But today I want to focus on one of our core missions in particular, our duty to secure our borders and enforce our immigration laws. This is one of the highest priorities of the President, the administration, and my department. Indeed, it is among the most fundamental responsibility of any sovereign nation. We face a crisis at our border, a real, serious, and sustained crisis. We have tens of thousands of illegal aliens arriving at our doorstep every month. We have drugs, criminals, and violence spilling into our country every week. And we have smugglers and traffickers who profit from human misery every single day by exploiting people who are seeking a better life, deceiving them about our laws, and fueling everything from sexual slavery to the smuggling of illicit goods. This chain of human misery is no more evident than with the tragic death of 7-year-old Jacqueline Cal McKean. Her death has deeply affected the Border Patrol agents involved in her case and the entire department. My heart goes out to her family and loved ones, and our entire department mourns this tragedy. What's more, the caravans, the so-called caravans headed towards our country, highlight how out of control the situation has become. Working with our partners, we have identified more than 600 criminals in the latest caravan flow, including individuals who have committed robberies, sexual assault, battery, and more. We cannot let them sneak into our country. That's why we have a legal process, a front door, to do the right screening and vetting to keep Americans safe. At the President's direction, we have confronted this crisis head-on, so for a moment, allow me to walk through some of the successes of the men and women of DHS in the past 2 years. We've championed a border wall system to include infrastructure, technology, and more personnel. We are building the first new border wall to go up in a decade and expanding replacement wall. Let me be clear, walls work. And where we have them, we are blocking illegal aliens from getting into our country. We need more, much more, from Congress. But if we don't get the resources, we will use every available option to ensure we can keep building. We have witnessed a dramatic uptick in the total apprehensions at the southern border, including a 25% increase in just 1 year. We've implemented virtually every measure within our authority to end, catch, and release, to keep as many illegal aliens as possible from being let go into our country. We've worked with the Pentagon to deploy troops to the southern border, which has helped us achieve tens of thousands of apprehensions and turnbacks. We've dramatically increased referrals for prosecution of single adults illegally crossing the border. We've launched a concerted effort to arrest criminal aliens with a focus on targeting violent gang members, resulting in a more than 10% increase in ICE arrests and removals over the past year. Today, I can say that now 9 in 10 aliens arrested are either a convicted criminal, have pending criminal charges, or are ICE fugitives. We've worked tirelessly with the Northern Triangle countries to counter migrant smuggling, human trafficking, transnational criminals, and the drug trade. We've stepped up efforts to protect women and children from being abused, kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and exploited. We've doubled the number of agreements with local law enforcement. We've ramped up efforts to combat opioids, and we're holding recalcitrant countries accountable. These successes and much, much more are a testament to our devoted workforce and their unbending commitment to the rule of law. But it's still not enough. We need Congress to act, or America's borders will never be fully secure. In fact, until we deal with the poorly written and outdated laws that contribute to this problem, the situation will only get worse. Simply put, the laws are not keeping up with the migrant flows. The legal loopholes are obvious. We've talked quite a bit about them. In the interest of time, Chairman, I'm happy to go back, but noticing the time, what I'd like to focus on is the fact that despite congressional inaction, we will not wait. We will not simply stand by as the crisis worsens. As the numbers go up, as the drugs flow in, as crime seeps into our communities, as the human toll grows along the very dangerous journey to our borders. For nearly 2 years, we've been working to stop illegal entry while also standing by our commitment to protect people who are actually fleeing real persecution. Sadly, many migrants have been misled by smugglers that they can claim asylum if they are seeking jobs or if they would like to reunite with their families. So the bottom line is this: all too frequently, if they say the magic words, they get a free pass into America. So today I am announcing historic measures to bring the situation under control. Effective immediately, the United States will begin the process of invoking Section 235(b)(2)(c) of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Once implemented, individuals arriving in or entering the United States from Mexico illegally or without proper documentation may be returned to Mexico for the duration of their immigration proceedings. They will not be able to disappear into the United States. They will have to wait for approval to come into the United States. If they are granted asylum by a U.S. judge, they will be welcomed into America. If they are not, they will be removed to their home countries. Let me be clear, we will undertake these steps consistent with our domestic and international legal obligations, including our humanitarian commitments. We have notified the Mexican government of our intended actions. In response, Mexico has informed us that they will commit to implement essential measures on their side of the border to facilitate this process by providing humanitarian assistance. They have announced that affected migrants will receive humanitarian visas to stay on Mexican soil. They will be given the ability to apply for work and be given other protections while they await a U.S. legal determination. In the coming days, we will discuss with Mexico ways to ensure the implementation of our decision in a way that is transparent, effective, and ensures a safe and orderly flow. Moreover, as was announced by the United States and Mexico on December 18th, both countries are also committed to work on a comprehensive plan to reduce irregular migration across the region. This is something I have personally spent years pursuing behind the scenes. I've had dozens of meetings with leaders from the Northern Triangle, convened private sector executives, and put forth proposals to address the root causes of illegal migration. We look forward to working with our Mexican partners to jointly address smuggling, trafficking, illegal cross-border activity throughout Central America once and for all. I cannot overstate the significance of these developments. We are taking lawful, unilateral action to stop illegal entry now. Mexico is taking its own appropriate actions in response, and our two countries have committed to a major regional plan to solve this crisis. I'm sure you'll have questions. I look forward to answering them today, but the credit for these bold actions belongs to the hardworking men and women who defend our territory every day. They will implement these measures professionally, compassionately, and in coordination with our close Mexican partners. These protocols will result in a significant decrease in illegal migration across our border, and importantly, they will disincentivize perilous journeys to the United States in the first place. In the meantime, our foreign partners and international organizations are working hard to ensure migrants receive assistance closer to home, closer from their point of departure. We've asked all countries in the region to increase their capacity for asylum so vulnerable populations can be assisted as soon as possible. This is not the end of the story. Once again, I still implore Congress to respond to the demands of the American people and close the immigration loopholes themselves, which are the source of our present dilemma. America is the most compassionate nation in the world and a beacon of hope for all who seek a better life. We can and should ensure that those aspiring to join our enduring republic can do so fairly, safely, and humanely, but not illegally. For that, we need your help. I thank this committee, and again, Chairman, my personal thanks and that of the department for your leadership. We wish you well in your retirement. We thank you for your leadership on these issues, and I look forward to answering the questions of the committee. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Secretary Nielsen. I appreciate your kind words, and congratulations to you and the other officials in the administration for succeeding in reaching a 235 B2C, or Remain in Mexico agreement. I know that the previous administration also tried to do so but was unsuccessful. How do you see such an agreement affecting the crisis occurring with those claiming credible fear along the southwest border?
So what we're trying to accomplish are, what I call the common cause elements of the crisis that we all share in the region. We want to be able to help those vulnerable populations as soon as possible. We do not want to have laws or loopholes that encourage them to put themselves at danger at the hands of smugglers and traffickers. We want to discourage those who are claiming asylum fraudulently. As you, Chairman, know better than anyone, 80% pass that initial credible fear test, but only 1 out of 10 from Central America are actually granted asylum by a judge. Much of that is because they've been misled by smugglers. This will make it clear what exactly our asylum laws allow for. We also have worked with the Mexicans and will continue, as I mentioned, to work out a technical agreement whereby we can be assured that they will be protected and provided for as they await their process in the United States.
Over the past year and a half, and in your written testimony, you've repeatedly asked Congress to close legislative loopholes that lead to the policy of catch and release of aliens along the southwest border. Please tell us which loopholes the department needs Congress to close.
Sure. So the first one relates to families. As you know, under a court ruling, under Flores, right now, if we detain a family who comes here illegally, we are only able to detain them with a child for 21 days. The difficulty with that is we cannot complete the court process within that time period. So we have been working on a reg, as you know, it's out for public comment, but what we are seeking to do is ensure that we can detain through removal. That is how the immigration process is meant to work. About a decade ago, as you know, removals recurred in a matter of hours. Now it can take years. So the goal here is to be able to not catch and release, but to catch and detain, or under our new protocols, to catch and remain in Mexico. The second one is UACs. We treat children differently. And that was because back in the day when the TVPRA was passed, the flow was very different. It used to be 98% from Mexico. Now it's about 60% from Central America. But if you're a child from Central America, you are treated differently than a Mexican child. So what that does is that enables an incentive for parents to unfortunately send their children unaccompanied on an extraordinarily dangerous journey to our borders. The third one is a court decision called Zavadas that we've talked about before. This requires the Department of Homeland Security to be able to return an illegal alien after a conviction back to their originating country within 180 days. If it is unlikely that we will be able to do that, we have to release them into the interior. The good news there is that we have had substantial progress with so-called recalcitrant countries, but the loophole itself encourages illegal behavior because there is no consequence. The fourth one I would just mention briefly is asylum. We've got to affix the asylum laws. The way that we know that is because, as I mentioned, 80% pass that initial credible fear, but only 10% are granted asylum by a judge. The process takes many years. In the meantime, the illegal alien is within the interior, has a work permit, and unfortunately, more than not, does not appear for court cases.
Thank you. On Tuesday, HHS announced that it would no longer require adult members of sponsor households to undergo biometric background checks before placing an unaccompanied alien child with the sponsor in the home. But such a requirement is a clear part of the April 2018 Memorandum of Agreement between CBP and ICE and the Administration for Children and Families and the Office of Refugees Resettlement at Health and Human Services, governing information sharing in unaccompanied alien child matters. What does the Department of Homeland Security plan to do, given that the Department of Health and Human Services has seemingly breached the agreement and will no longer be providing DHS biometric information regarding adults living in households with unaccompanied children?
So there's been some confusion about that announcement. Every sponsor in which the UAC will be placed will continue to be fingerprinted and a background check will be run. What the Department of Health and Human Services decided to do, as I understand it, is they will continue to collect the fingerprints and do the background checks on household adults, not the sponsor, but other adults living in the household. But that will not prevent them from placing the UAC with the sponsor in the interim. So the checks will continue to be done. It's one of sequencing. As to the larger question, we will continue to work with HHS to make sure that the MOU is fully implemented.
And finally, isn't it true that children are being exploited by adults in order to leverage loopholes in immigration law and come to the U.S. since they know that they will be released once they get here if they have a child with them? Hasn't this resulted in instances where children have been raped, otherwise harmed, or even died?
Yes, sir. This is one of the more concerning parts of this flow. The smugglers and traffickers are not humanitarians. It's a business enterprise for them. The stats are staggering. 30% of females on this journey are sexually abused. 70% of all migrants are victims of some form of violence. 17% of males are sexually abused. The children, unfortunately, face the exact same situation. So as a result, as an example, we give a pregnancy test to all girls who are over 9 years old because of the dangers of the journey and our desire to make sure that we can protect them. Adults do realize, as are smugglers and traffickers, that if they grab a kid and they appear at the border, they will come in. Worst case scenario, they will be detained for 20 days and then they will be released. Yes, the fraud continues to grow. It's extraordinarily dangerous.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask you a number of questions. First of all, you just said, Madam Secretary, that removals of people who applied for political asylum but didn't get it used to take hours, now they take years. And you said they should be detained. So what you're really saying, are you not, is that anyone who applies legitimately or otherwise for political asylum should expect to be detained for years, correct?
We do have a 700 to 800,000 person backlog in the courts.
Okay, just please, I don't have too much time. Correct, that's what you're saying. Anyone who applies for asylum, legitimately or not, should expect to be detained for years.
Under our laws, if you do not have a legal right to be here, you are detained until you're
And you're saying they should expect to be detained for years, correct?
If you don't have a legal right to be here, you
No, no, even if you do have a legal right to be
But we
here.
don't know, sir, if they do yet.
That's
is the
right, we
point.
don't. But anyone who applies for asylum, whether they have a legal right to get it or not, should be detained for years. That's the effect of what you're saying.
Yes, not for
Okay.
years, until the
For
court,
years.
until
Yeah.
their court is complete. And if
But
I,
you, excuse me, I don't have the time, so just answer my questions, please. Why not instead speed up the process? Why not appoint more judges? It shouldn't take years. It used to take hours. Why should it take years now to adjudicate the case?
it takes years now, sir, because the numbers are so substantially higher than
Has the
they were.
administration requested additional funds to appoint additional immigration
For
judges?
judges, yes, they
How
have.
much?
I don't know, sir. That's a DOJ. We don't have the immigration judges. I can get you that number, though.
All right, but we should clearly substantially increase the number of hearing officers and judges. My second question really is, well, I'm not going to ask, you said that 80% of people have passed a credible fear interview, but only 10% get asylum.
Yes, sir.
Anyone who has a credible fear, by our laws, should get asylum. Why the distinction
No,
between the 80% and the 10%?
The thresholds are different. So what we do is we do an initial credible fear screening by the USCIS, and then when it gets to a judge, the judge uses...
All right. The criteria are different is what you're saying. Fine. I would simply note that a policy that deliberately says that anyone who legitimately deserves political asylum should spend years in detention seems to be in gross violation of international law and of United States law.
Understand, sir, but that's not what I said. So it's not
It is
that
what
they
you
have.
said. You
No.
admitted to me it's what you said. All right,
They've made
next.
a claim for credible fear. They have not been granted asylum.
didn't
so
ask
we
that.
don't know.
Any-
1 out of 10 are granted asylum, sir.
Fine,
The other
and
9
those
are
1
not.
out of 10 will spend years in detention.
Well, the other 9 do not have a legitimate cause for
Fine,
asylum.
I'm talking about the 1 out of 10.
Okay, then
Anyone who legitimately seeks political asylum,
the fastest way to get them through the system is through detention. Detention, no, it's true. It's
all right,
40 days
excuse
for
me,
detention. It's
reclaiming
1,300
my
days
time.
without
The
detention.
faster way would be to have more judges and to have a better process, obviously. Now, let me ask you a
Let me
different question.
interrupt the gentleman for just a moment, and just to assure the Secretary, the gentleman does control the time, but I will afford you time at the conclusion of his time if you want to answer the question further, as I have done for other witnesses in the past.
Let us discuss the tragic incident of Jacqueline Kalmakin. Let's start from the top. It is legal to apply for asylum whether or not a person comes to a designated port of arrival, correct?
Currently, yes, sir.
Thank you. Let's put aside your department's effort to deny asylum to anyone who crosses between the ports, an effort which has now been enjoined. You have strongly indicated your preference that asylum seekers should present themselves at ports, correct?
Yes.
Did you anticipate this might result in an increase in the number of asylum seekers coming to the ports?
As the numbers go up, yes, sir.
You are, after all, effectively taking those who might otherwise apply between the ports and adding them to those who are already come to the ports, so that would lead to greater numbers. You've just said yes. Despite this anticipated increase, capacity to process asylum seekers at ports of entry appears to have gone down, not up. DHS has increased metering at certain ports, causing long backlogs of asylum seekers at the border. And we have seen no effort to increase processing at ports given your desire to shift where people apply for asylum. Is DHS limiting processing at ports in an effort to deter asylum seekers from coming in the future?
No, sir. We are
Thank you.
trying.
Are you engaged in any effort to increase processing at ports?
Yes.
Are media reports correct that CBP has recently implemented so-called port hardening, where CBP is actually reducing its processing capacity at the ports?
Port hardening is something very different than queuing. The queuing is based on all of the missions that we have to do at the border, which includes
But are you doing anything that would reduce your capacity to process people, X number of people per day at the ports?
I'm not sure what the question means. No, sir. We're trying to execute all of our missions at the ports of
No.
entry.
Are you doing anything that slows down, that reduces the number of people who can be processed at the ports on a daily or weekly basis?
We are meeting all of our missions. So in the amount of what we have to do between national security, between narcotics, between economic security, and those without paperwork, at certain ports, we do not have capacity to do all of that at the same time. So that is why the queuing occurs. We take them as they come so that we meet our
I
requirements.
understand all that. My question is, are you doing anything that you didn't used to do
2 minutes over time.
that is reducing the capacity to process people at the ports?
No, I mean,
Oh,
we're
thank you.
continuing to do what we need to do to execute
Now,
all of our
you're saying that
missions.
there's complete queuing here, obviously. Why have you not asked Congress for more port funding, either to increase capacity or to add more officers? And will that change in the FY 2020 budget?
We have asked for more for the ports of entry. We've asked for more officers at the ports of entry. We've also asked for more Border Patrol agents.
All right. As mentioned in my opening statement, your own Inspector General found evidence that turning away asylum seekers may have caused an increase in illegal crossing attempts. One asylum seeker interviewed by the IG stated that she had been turned away 3 times by an officer on the bridge before deciding to take her chances on illegal entry. Do you concur with the IG's conclusion that metering may have unintended consequences, such as leading some aliens who would otherwise seek legal entry into the United States to cross the border illegally?
The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
In my experience, illegal aliens do whatever they can to cross illegally.
That's not the question.
It is. So
No,
if they can't
the
go one
question
way, they'll
was,
come another
do
way.
you agree with the IG's conclusion that metering at the ports may have the consequence of leading some aliens who would otherwise seek legal entry at the ports to cross the border illegally?
Illegal aliens are very committed to coming into this country. If they can't get in one way, they will try to come in
So
another
you
way.
agree with the IG then?
There's a lot more context to that report, sir. So yes, illegal aliens will try to come here illegally if that is their intent.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Nielsen, first of all, thank you for your excellent testimony today and for your steadfast efforts to uphold our immigration laws. I regret the deplorable treatment you have unfairly received for doing your job. Those who disagree with immigration policy should not try to coerce officials into ignoring the laws they have sworn to defend. Nor should the media only give one side of the story, as they usually do, as you have seen. The American people oppose the liberal open borders mentality. Thankfully, voters continue to favor immigration policies that put the interest of Americans first. Speaking of the interest of Americans, I'd like to ask you first about the E-Verify system, the employment verification program. E-Verify is over 99% accurate. It's now used to cover 1/3 of the American workforce. 1,500 employers sign up for it every week. And it's probably the most popular immigration reform we have. Over about 80% of the American people support it. What is the administration doing to promote E-Verify or expand E-Verify?
Apologies. When it comes to E-Verify, as you know, we have expanded efforts within the federal agencies. So OMB has directed that federal agencies use E-Verify, our contractors use E-Verify. For the private sector, what we've done over the last couple of years is we've made it much easier. As you know, over time, we've made a lot of improvements, but now it's much faster. You get results much more quickly. So we're seeing the use expanded because it's an easier tool.
It takes about a minute to check on an individual.
Yes, sir.
Something
Much,
like that.
much faster.
Would you like to see Congress make it a requirement?
I'm sorry?
Would you like for Congress to make it a requirement for the employers across the United
I
States?
think it's important that we continue to use it. So however we can expand that use, yes, sir, we agree with.
Okay, thanks. Let me turn to illegal immigration. Isn't it true that the facilities and resources used by CBP and ICE to house illegal immigrants apprehended along the southwest border are the same facilities and infrastructure as used for such purposes during the Obama administration?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to the problem of illegal immigration, which I think is a lot greater than most people realize. And let me ask you for some figures so we can kind of quantify the problem. How many individuals crossed our borders illegally last year would be the first part of the question. And also, how many individuals came into our country, overstayed their visas, and then acquired illegal status last year as well?
So we apprehended 400,000 illegal aliens last year. Right now, we're averaging about 2,100 a day, 2,100
How many
a day.
people do you think succeeded in crossing our border illegally last year?
So 2,100 a day are the ones who have crossed illegally, sir. So each day now, we stop 2,100 on our border crossing illegally.
And then the Border Patrol estimate that about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 get through for every one they apprehend, or not necessarily?
I'm sorry, for some reason the sound is...
Doesn't the Border Patrol estimate that many times the number they actually apprehend succeed in crossing our border illegally every day or every year? And what would be the total number you estimate crossed our border illegally last year? Not who were apprehended, who actually succeeded in getting into the country illegally.
So the ones that we know about are the ones that I can tell you about. I'm happy to get you a modeled figure on the larger number, but it's 400,000 that we stopped last year.
Okay. Do you have any estimate as to how many succeeded in crossing illegally?
So the crossing, so what we do is we apprehend after they cross the border. So when I say 2,100 a day, that's 2,100 who did cross the border illegally, and then we apprehended them.
That many.
Yes,
okay.
sir, once they came on.
And then how many visa overstayers came into the country, overstayed their visa, and then became illegal?
So the visa overstay is something that we are working on. We're working on with other countries as well, so that if you are a country where you have a substantial portion of your citizens who overstay your visas, we are working with them on that side to reduce the fraud. The exact number I don't have, sir, but we can get it.
But isn't the estimate that something like at least almost as many come into the country and overstay their visas as who actually cross the border illegally? Isn't that a rough estimate?
The number is high, sir, but we're happy to verify that.
Okay. What do you guess that the total is every year, but combination of illegal crossers and illegal overstayers?
My guess, and I'll get you the number, we're probably about 600,000.
Okay. I think that is a good way for the American people to understand how great the problem is. Thank you for your testimony again today, and Mr. Chairman, you are back.
Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, I wanted to raise a quick issue about something that's happening in my district. I have received reports that ICE officers in Morgan Hill are not adhering to ICE protocols, that they are keeping detainees for long periods of time in vans, that they're denying access to attorneys. I will give you the details, but I'm hopeful that you will give me a full report and that you'll investigate that's happening, or the reports I've received in my district. I just would like to note that, you know, a Supreme Court decision is not a loophole. A statute duly enacted by the United States, by the Congress, signed into law, it's not a loophole. That's the law, and it's up to the executive branch to see that the laws are faithfully executed. So I just think it's important that we use the right language when we discuss the law. And another thing, the 10% figure that you used for success in asylum is not correct only if you look at unadjudicated cases or cases that received other relief. For example, under the Convention Against Torture, could you get to that number? And I'd be happy to show you those numbers later, but I have a very brief period of time. Following up on where Ranking Member Nadler left off, we had a staff briefing by DHS a couple of weeks ago, and we posed a question about metering, and in response, the CBP officer said that DHS was not seeking to increase processing, and this is exactly what he said: the more we process, the more will come. And it was clear to our staff, at least, that metering was being used to deter people from actually seeking asylum. Now, that's not what the INA, the Immigration Nationality Act, provides for. And so my question is, how San Ysidro Port is now, as I understand it, metering just 100 cases per day. How was the decision made to have just 100 cases a day processed? Is that the actual capacity? And do you think it's legal to limit processing through the metering program? And if so, what is the limit? Could you limit it to 1, to 5? What's the statutory basis for the decision?
So first, of course, I'm happy to work with you on the report and work with you on that. With respect to the queuing, so what's important to understand is that we have many missions at the border. It's not just those who arrive without paperwork. So first and foremost, we worry about national security, right? Then we're worried about narcotics. We also do trade and commerce. So we.
But my specific question is.
It's capacity. It's capacity. So we do as.
So it's only 100 a day that you have the capacity to do for asylum cases?
Correct.
Is that your testimony?
Correct.
Okay. I'd love to go further in this, but we're limited to 5 minutes, as you know. And I want to talk about the new policy that has just been announced. Has Section 235B2C ever been used in the way that the administration is proposing to use it today? That's question number one. Question number two, do you have a legal opinion that states that Section 232BC2 can be used in this way? And finally, if you take a look at the statute, it specifically says that there's an exception, and the exception is in 235B2C is found at 235B1II, specifically exempting asylum claims from that section. Final question, is it the intention of the department to treat unaccompanied child applicants in the same way as the broader asylee population under this new policy?
We have been working very closely with the Department of Justice and the Office of Legal Counsel. With respect to the children, we will continue to follow TVPRA. As you know, if an unaccompanied child comes in,
so children would be excluded from this?
Yes, ma'am, except for Mexicans, which, as you know, is a
I understand that. I will just note that we've had many tragedies here, but we just received a report from two of our colleagues, Congressman Gomez and Congresswoman Barragan, who went down to Tijuana and to meet with the asylees. They ended up spending the night on U.S. territory, surrounded by Border Patrol agents who harassed them and the other asylum applicants. They described conditions that were really quite horrendous and very abusive on the part of Border Patrol agents. Now, I wasn't there, but I did receive the testimony of our colleagues. I think it does not paint a favorable picture of an administration that is taking seriously the need to apply our immigration laws. Obviously, we have a problem in Central America. We need to be working with our other partners in the Western Hemisphere to deal with the violence there. It is not preferable to deal with violence at our border, but the law requires, if we fail to do that, we must follow our immigration laws in a careful, thoughtful way, administer it properly, and I think you'll be seen in court, as you know, on this new announcement. Your policy does not adhere to the requirements of the immigration law. If it does, the rest of the immigration law might as well not be written, and that is not a fair reading.
Time of the
law.
gentlewoman has
I yield
expired.
back.
The secretary can respond to that if it's a question and she chooses to.
I'm happy to understand what your colleagues were discussing. What I can tell you is that the brave men and women of the Border Patrol every single day do their jobs, and they do it with compassion, and they enforce the law.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Secretary, let me say, I for one appreciate your effort and the administration's effort to finally bring some sanity to our asylum policies that have been exploited and abused for far too long right now. As you know, smugglers oftentimes give the magic words, the folks coming in, whether they're coming in groups or in a caravan. They're told what to say, they say it. As you indicated, they are given a court date, oftentimes disappear into the population. The vast majority never appear for their court dates, and so our laws, as they've been implemented for a long time, have really been a joke. And you're trying to end that, so I commend you for that. Anything you'd like to say in response to that?
My only response, sir, is I want to make sure everyone has a clear understanding of how the asylum process is not working. Even when those claim asylum, after that initial screening, 40% never file an application. If they really needed and wanted asylum, they would follow through. 31% never show up for their court date. We have a huge problem with asylum fraud. We need to work together to combat it.
Thank you very much for making an effort to do that. Now I'm going to shift gears to something entirely different. I have a theme park in the Warren County portion of my congressional district back in southwestern Ohio that struggled for a number of years to keep up with the seasonal demands, because amusement parks generally are open in the spring through fall, and then they close over the winter. It's a similar story that I'm sure you've heard from many other members about seasonal employers in their districts who are having trouble keeping up with seasonal demands. And they look to the H-2B program oftentimes, and we've discussed that. I know I met with a group of members with yourself some months back. That program is administered by your agencies, and they're being told that there aren't sufficient visas available, is the bottom line. This despite the fact that Congress has given the agency, your agency, the discretion to provide additional visas to address the need. Now, a lot of small businesses in my district and districts all across the country have also been adversely impacted by the lack of H-2B visas and the resulting lack of seasonal employees. As well as being a member of this committee, I happen to be the chairman of the House Small Business Committee. For now, I'll be the ranking member in the next Congress. That's another story. Because of the problem, it impacts so many small businesses, especially in a strong economy with record low unemployment. I've introduced the season Act. It's a bipartisan bill which would address this, but these things, they're hard to get through Congress because of the House and the Senate and 60-vote rule over there. But what we have done in this Congress is to provide your agency with the discretion to issue more visas in the fiscal year 18 omnibus bill as a temporary solution. So in any event, your agency determined that the number was, I think, about 5,000 additionals that you provided. There are a lot of folks who think that ought to be higher. The Labor Department, for example, said it ought to be 10 times the 15,000. And so where are you on that, and what can you do to get additional H-2B visas if they're needed? And I would argue that they are.
Yes, so I did write a letter to all members of Congress on this topic, as you know. I do think and encourage and ask that Congress pass authorizing language on this. We need a cap. When we went through this last year, I asked every member of Congress that had a concern in his or her district, what are the numbers that you need? What are you hearing from businesses? What are the specific cases where the needs are not being met? Congress is in a very unique position to understand what that cap number should be. But having a cap is very important because it provides the predictability and stability for businesses to plan. So when you give the discretion to DHS and then the appropriations is late, two things happen. That second season never gets any, and businesses cannot plan because they don't know what the number will be. So what I respectfully request is that Congress put a number in law, that we address what temporary means, because there's still some confusion around that. These were meant, as you say, to be temporary and seasonal, and we're happy to work with you on language. I'm not familiar with specific language of the Season Act, but I completely agree this is an area that we need to address.
Thank you very much. I'm almost out of time. Let me mention one final thing. Chairman McCall and I had introduced legislation relative to drones and the threat that they impose, whether they're terrorists or criminals or others that may wish us ill. An incident right now is occurring yesterday and today at Gatwick Airport. Could you comment on that from a Homeland Security perspective, what we can do about that threat?
Yes, first I just want to thank you and other members of Congress who helped us get that legislation done. It's monumentally important. This is a real threat. We see drones coming across our border dropping off drugs. We see drones that we're not sure what their intent is flying around our airports, our critical infrastructure. We see them surveilling sensitive locations and disrupting communications. And of course, abroad, unfortunately, we've seen them quite easily weaponized. So we are working on the implementation plan based on the authority that you gave the Department and the Department of Justice. We are using everything we've learned from the Department of Defense and then applying it as appropriate in civilian contexts. And we look forward very much to come and briefing you on that. But this is an emerging threat, and we thank you for your leadership.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ma'am, when did you first learn of the death of 7-year-old Jacqueline McKean?
So I believe my front office staff was notified around if I have the dates right, the 7th, and then Commissioner McAleenan gave me a full readout email on the 13th.
On the 13th?
Yes, sir.
Did you inquire about it between the 7th and the 13th?
Yes, and as you know, the facts continue to come to light now, but yes, sir.
What actions did you take between the 7th and the 13th?
Some of it is to just try to understand what happened. As you know, this was an extraordinarily remote location, so we have begun investigations, and our IG is looking into this, among others, but to try to understand what other options might have been available.
Okay, thank you. How many children 17 years old or younger have died in DHS, ICE, or CBP custody since you took office?
I will get back to you on that figure. What I can tell you is that we have saved 4,200 migrants who are at distress due to their journey.
Approximately how many have died?
I understand your question, sir. I will get back to you.
Can you give me an approximate figure?
I will get back to you. I'm not going to guess under oath.
All right. Do you view those who you call illegal aliens to be human or subhuman?
Illegal aliens are human, sir.
All right. And do you believe that these illegal aliens approaching our southern border are in search of safety and security primarily, or primarily in search of a job?
So what we find with the flow, the most current flow over the last couple years, are the vast majority are either economic migrants or they're looking to reunify with their families.
All right. Do you believe that DHS was prepared to implement your family separation policy when it went into effect?
Sir, we never had a policy for family separation. What we did do was we applied the law equally to anybody who broke it, and if you were an illegal crosser of the southwest border, we, to the extent that we could, referred you for prosecution.
You're aware that both the DHS Inspector General and GAO concluded that DHS was inadequately prepared to implement the family separation policy in an organized and efficient manner. Are you familiar with that report?
I'm familiar with parts of the report, yes, sir.
Do you agree with it or disagree?
I don't agree with the premise of the question. We never had a policy, nor do we now, to separate families as a
All
policy.
right. Well, let me ask you a simple question. When the decision was made to prosecute parents, it was DHS that physically separated the parent from his or her children. Is that correct?
If the parent was referred to prosecution and was going to a criminal setting, we do not send the children with the parent at that time.
How is it possible that your agency performed a separation policy when it did not have an ability to keep adequate records for eventual reunification of parent and child?
So each parent in our custody did have access to communicating with their children. The children
How was it that you were able to implement the policy without having a means of being able to reunite children with their parents?
We did have a means. What we have done is improved it so that it's much more expedited and the technical systems
At one
interoperate.
point, DHS and HHS announced the existence of a central database containing location information for separated parents and minors. You familiar with that announcement?
We have updated all of our systems, but I think you're probably
Are you familiar
referring,
with that announcement when it was made?
there's quite a few systems. You might be referring to the one from June.
Okay, well, the IG found no evidence that a database ever existed.
There is a database, sir. We know where all the children were. We knew where all the parents were.
Do you disagree with that IG finding?
I don't have the language in front of me, sir. I'm happy to get back to you very specifically in response to that question. What I can tell you is ICE has a database, CBP has a database, and the Department of Health and Human Services also has a database.
But there was no database containing location information for separated parents and minors.
Again, we did know within each individual agency.
So are you trying to say that there has been no problem with your agency reuniting parents and children separated at the border in accordance with your separation policy?
The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness will be permitted to answer the question.
Sure. We've complied with the court order, sir. We've worked very closely with the court and
You are a
reunited.
champion at avoiding
The time of the
directly
gentleman has
answering
expired.
my questions.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
And I would note for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Regular order.
I would note that every other member has been allowed to proceed with their questionings for more than the 5 minutes that I was given. And so I take it as a compliment that
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair would just say to the gentleman that that's true of everyone before you except for me, and I'm going to enforce it from now on. We gave you the opportunity to ask a question beyond your time expiring, and we gave Ms. Nielsen the opportunity
and
to respond.
unfortunately, I was unable to get a specific answer to any of the questions that I asked.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that in light of your change in policy that it may not harm Mr. Johnson, I'd ask unanimous consent that it be given an additional minute.
The objection is heard. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, when we finish our exchange, I'll try to leave a moment, and if you want to further answer his question, I certainly would be happy to hear it. I now ask unanimous consent that the article from Focus magazine dated 1/27 of 17 be placed in the record. Mr. Chairman? Without.
That objection be made a
Thank
part of the
you.
record.
This article and so many that have over the years appeared in the Union Tribune, the San Diego paper, deals with the wall that we in San Diego would thank Duncan Hunter Sr. for making sure occurred years and years ago. And I want to note for the record that in San Diego, people periodically come to my office and say, don't build the wall. Not once has anyone said, tear down that wall in San Diego that has saved countless lives. In the case of San Diego, this article, and I'd like you to comment on it and give me your thoughts, shows the drop in mortality, in people dying coming across the border with the advent of that wall that eliminated their essentially coming across and dying. In addition to that, we continue in San Diego with Duncan Hunter's own brother to provide aid to try to help people from dying in the desert. So I want you to, for a moment, just tell us about what the border wall means, where it is in place from a standpoint of safety for people like the late Brian Terry, who was gunned down in an area that didn't have a fence, or what it means for potential undocumented aliens coming into the country, their lives.
Yes, sir. So as you know, in San Diego and Yuma, to use two examples, once we had a wall up, the flow of illegal aliens dropped by 95%. It's extraordinarily significant walls work. The reason they're important is because as Secretary of Homeland Security, I want to be able to assure the American people that we know who is coming into our country. If they come in illegally, I don't know who they are. So the idea of having folks go to a port of entry and having impedance and denial as part of a wall system is to ensure that that flow is safe and orderly. What I can tell you is we stopped 3,000 special interest aliens at the border last year. We stopped 10 known and suspected terrorists from attempting to travel to the United States each year. As I already mentioned, we have 600 criminals just in this one caravan flow. So it's very important that we have impedance and denial that drives the flow to a safe and orderly process so that we can understand who they are and we can effectively process claims.
And it's fair to say that San Diego is the busiest land border anywhere in the world, correct?
San Ysidro is very busy, yes, sir.
Okay, so busiest port, land port for both people and goods coming in, back and forth, a wall in place for 2 decades or more, and a lowering of loss of life and better order. That's the record of that military-built fence/wall at the border under this Congress over a period of many years.
Yes, it also facilitates legal trade and travel. I mean, that is the goal of that border as well, to facilitate legal trade and travel. The wall allows us to do that.
Well, I'm very proud of the border trade in San Diego and what it's done for the economies on both sides. And I do consider that fence/wall critical because it has allowed us to make the case for more border trade and more people passing legally through the border. I want to go to one more thing that's been brought up by my Democratic friends many, many times. Your authority is broad. I see you have a detailee, or I'm sorry, one of your aides from the Coast Guard. You have law enforcement in addition to border in which you're dealing with Americans every day, not undocumented people, but Americans, right? U.S. citizens. Can you explain to me why my friends on the other side of the aisle want you to treat people who are not Americans, unknown, accompanied by a minor child that is unknown at that moment as to whether it's actually their family member, why we should treat them in the case of an arrest different than you would somebody that was caught and arrested, let's say in a boat, sitting off of Florida's coast, a legal American citizen, or somebody that's apprehended in an airport, or somebody else under your administration who is an American who's arrested similarly with a minor child. Why should we, in fact, allow them to not be treated exactly the same as we do Americans when arrested under your authority?
Sir, I cannot opine on what others might say. What I can assure you is that the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security are committed to enforcing the laws as passed by Congress. We are the largest federal law enforcement agency.
But if you arrest an American at an airport and they've got a child with them and they've committed a crime, they are routinely split up,
yes,
even
sir,
though they're
are.
U.S. citizens. Why would we treat a non-citizen differently than we do a U.S. citizen?
I cannot answer that question for you. I think that we should apply the law equally to everyone who breaks it.
I agree. Would you answer anything further you want to for Mr. Johnson, please?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez, for 5 minutes.
Secretary Nielsen, the majority on this committee must think you're doing a fantastic job because they've ordered this hearing so that you could come before us and look tough and remorseless just in the time for the holidays. The remorseless secretary during the holidays. Christmas, as they like to make sure and specify. I suspect that if you still have your job, which seems to always be a big question, in 3 weeks, we'll see if you still have the same sympathetic questions when you come back. I want to start by praising this administration and the role that it's had. Because there's one thing that this administration's done better than any other administration in American history, and that is lie. I still remember the first day when the press secretary came out and said this is the largest inauguration crowd ever in the history of America. Of course, everybody laughed because there were more people at other inaugurations. And the president's own remarks, on a world stage, the UN General Assembly, he said he had accomplished more as president than anyone before him. And the world laughed because the evidence was plain to see that that just wasn't true. But specifically in the area of Homeland Security, lying has become elevated to an astounding level of mendacity. President Trump descended the golden escalators at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy by saying Mexico was sending us the worst rapists, murderers. Then he said he was required to break up migrant families because of bad laws that the Democrats gave us. How about the one about Mexico paying for the wall? You want $5 million and you want $5 billion and you want the American public to pay for it. Isn't Mexico supposed to pay for it? Wasn't that the campaign promise? No, that's just another lie. And all about the ones about the massive invasion via the immigrant caravan that would ruin America. How about when Trump said, good people among the Nazis and white supremacists demonstrating? That time nobody was laughing, but the evidence was plain to see, and these are gigantic lies. I remember when the CHC met with your predecessor, your boss now, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, and he dropped a few whoppers himself. The most memorable for me is when he sat, I want everybody, because you weren't there, when he sat with the Hispanic Congressional Caucus in the Capitol in a room full of Hispanic members of Congress, most of whose parents and grandparents were immigrants that didn't speak English when they came here. And he said to us, and he looked us in the eyes and he said, the reason we can't have too many poor, uneducated Latinos in America is because they will never assimilate into American culture like previous waves of immigrants, referring to the Irish, the Italians, and the Norwegians. I would not assimilate. The members of Congress, duly elected, would not assimilate, so we couldn't have more. He said that to us. It's almost as though we were invisible to him. Secretary Could told a room full of Hispanic congressmen and women that poor, uneducated Latinos, a lot like my mom and my dad, who didn't speak a lick of English, but you want to change the policy so that if you want to come to this country, you have to speak English, would never fit, and that their children could never acquire the position of members of the Congress of the United States in this democracy. A lie, because it's happened time and time again. It is as you can't see the reality of modern immigration or contributions of anyone who came from countries other than Norway and other parts of Europe. It's as if you and the Trump administration are blind. And you know what? It seems like you agree with Tucker Carlson that immigrants only bring danger and dirt and division. But I have to say the all-time record for lying in the face of all the evidence was a tweet you, Madam Secretary, sent out on June the 17th. And it says, we do not have a policy of separating families at the border, period. That's your Twitter account. That's what you put out. Yet you came here today to tell us exactly is your policy of separating families and children from their families. Another lie. I know I have 45 seconds. I won't take them all. But it is repugnant to me and astonishing to me that during Christmas, I like to call them the holiday seasons to be inclusive, but during Christmas, because the majority always wants to just call it Christmas, that during Christmas, a time in which we celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ, a Jesus Christ who had to flee for his life with Mary and Joseph. Thank God there wasn't a wall that stopped him from seeking refuge in Egypt. Thank God that wall wasn't there. And thank God there was an administration like this, or he would have too have perished on the 28th, on the day of innocence, when Herod ordered the murder of every child under 2 years of age. Maybe I haven't gone a lot to Bible school, but I know that part. Thank God. Shame on everybody that separates children and allows them to stay at the other side of the border, fearing death, fearing hunger, fearing sickness. Shame on us for wearing our badge of Christianity during Christmas and allow the secretary to come here and lie. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. If the secretary would care to respond to any of that.
Only then to say that calling me a liar are fighting words. I'm not a liar. We've never had a policy for family separation. I'm happy to walk the gentleman through it again. A policy of family separation would mean that any family that I encountered in the interior, I would separate. It would mean that any family that I found at a port of entry, I would separate. It would mean that every single family that I found illegally crossing, we would separate. We did none of those. What we did do is uphold the laws that Congress has passed, and we prosecuted those who choose to come here illegally. As far as not being compassionate, let me just tell you what I have done. And of course, he couldn't be bothered to stay, so I'm happy to tell the rest of the committee. What we have done is we have worked extensively with the Northern Triangle countries to find ways to help vulnerable populations as soon in their journey as possible. The current system puts them at the hands of those who prey on them and who abuse them. So we've worked extensively to increase asylum capacity to help them as soon as possible. We've worked on child exploitation, including very unfortunate new crimes, which are live distance abuse, where somebody goes online and directs an abuser on how to abuse a child as they watch. That is a crime that DHS investigates and prosecutes. We have worked against traffickers. We have the first anti-smuggling, anti-trafficking strategy this January. We do investigations, we help survivors. I take personal offense on behalf of the 240,000 men and women of the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Secretary Nielsen. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Nielsen. I appreciate your response. For me, my Christmas present is that this is the last time I have to listen to that level of demagoguery in this committee, and I'm quite happy about that, being an optimist as I am. And I wanted to ask you, in some of the earlier questions that you were asked, there was a question about the young person who passed away in the custody of DHS. And do you have any numbers on those who died on the way from Central America, even as a part of the caravan, let alone the broader universe of people? What kind of fatalities exist from, say, north of the Panama Canal onto the Rio Grande River or our southern border?
Yes, sir, I don't have a final number. I'm happy to get back to you. The number I can give you is that the men and women of the Border Patrol saved 4,200 migrants last year who found themselves in remote parts of the border and were in a health situation or otherwise needed rescuing.
And that would be on the U.S. side of the border?
Yes, sir, but in some cases in cooperation with the Mexican authorities, we will help those in trouble on their side as well.
And I'm aware of that, and I've experienced some of that myself, hands-on even. But what about the fatalities all the way down to Central America? Do you have any numbers or any reports on that you can give us an idea of?
We're happy to compile what we have. We do get some figures from the countries along the way, but as you can imagine, some of that depends on their record keeping. But yes, sir, we can get you the most comprehensive number we have.
And so in order to get something into the record here today, because people won't be paying attention.
Thousands and thousands and thousands.
There.
Yes, sir.
That's the scope that I wanted to get an understanding of. And I've sat in this committee for 16 years. I heard much testimony from that table down there. It often started out with how many people died in the Arizona desert trying to get into America. I've commissioned 3 GAO studies over that period of time, asking the question this: how many Americans died at the hands of those who did get into America? And the numbers that came back, 28% of those incarcerated in our federal penitentiaries, criminal aliens. Second report was 24%, third report 21%. Those numbers have been dropping, but it's still a substantial amount. So I'm going to ask you a two-part question so it doesn't sound like a trick. Do you have the total number of illegal aliens in the United States, that versus the total number of criminal aliens in the United States? Do you have a sense of what those numbers are?
We do have a sense, sir, but as you know, the number continues to grow. So it's tens of millions. What we do know is we have 1 million right now on a detained and non-detained docket with orders of removal to process.
And have you reflected upon this thing that when I came to this town, there were 11 million illegals in America. That number grew to 12, seemed to stick there, seemed to drift back to 11. But we don't think that's the number, either one of us. And we saw a report some time back of about 22 million looked like it was an estimate that was fairly well respected. Is that essentially the benchmark number that you're working with?
It's somewhere between there, yes, sir. But it is higher than originally estimated.
And then with regard to the costs to American taxpayers, the Federation for American Immigration Reform has a number of $134 billion in government assistance. I'm going to presume you've seen that. And they point out that there's about $18 billion paid in taxes. So there's a net of about $116 billion cost to the American taxpayers to the population of illegal aliens in the United States. Do you generally accept those numbers conceptually?
I don't have any reason to disagree, sir. The numbers that I have is about $70,000 a day for an adult illegal alien to get through the process of removal when they have no right to stay. And it's $700 a day to take care of unaccompanied children who are sent here and separated before the border by their parents.
And when they're a family unit, how do you verify they're a family unit?
So we work with the consulates, actually. In some cases, with the consulates and with permission, we'll use biometrics. We, of course, begin with an interview of the adults, but we use all the facts that we have to assure that there is a familiar relationship.
Those biometrics would be what kind of biometrics?
If they're willing to submit to it a DNA test.
And if they say no, then?
We work through the consulate and we try to understand the birth, the lineage through birth certificates,
If you refuse to do a breathalyzer test and you're picked up for driving, perhaps under the influence of alcohol, you're presumed guilty if you refuse the test. Do we have any tool like that? If they refuse a DNA test, a little swipe of the gums?
We do not have that presumption right now, sir.
But I would support something like that just in case for future reference. And if I could provide for you a cheaper method for DNA testing that's quicker and more precise, is that something that the department would be interested in?
Yes, in conjunction with HHS, because as you know, they have the children eventually.
Right.
Yes, sir.
And that's something I do intend to follow up on. I'm watching my clock run down here. I'd love to have another 10 minutes, but I'm going to yield back and thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you, sir.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Let me thank the chairman very much for yielding, and let me thank the secretary for her service to the nation. I agree with one thing that Mr. King has said. I wish that we could have more time for the serious questions that we have. So I'll try to be as quick as possible. First of all, let me say that having worked as a member of the Homeland Security Committee, I am one of the strongest supporters, and we happen to be in the Judiciary Committee, of the Homeland Security Department. I have worked extensively with Customs and Border Protection. I've worked extensively with Border Patrol, Secret Service, and many other subsets of the department, and we worked well. Served as the ranking member on transportation security and chairwoman of transportation security, ranking member on border security. So to them, let me say Coast Guard as well, I've worked with, and the work is important. FEMA, the work is important. So I say to those individuals that find themselves on the northern and southern border, they know, the union included, and my door is open to speak to them, that they have values of which they are trained to uphold. And I would caution them that just because of the mean-spirited leadership that is now coming from the administration, it is no reason to violate your own moral standards and culture of service to the nation. My door is open. And I say that because it does not help when foolish comments are made about a border wall, and our very important military are down there during the Christmas holiday and Thanksgiving because they rise and serve for foolish reasons. So, Madam Secretary, Jackie did not have to die.
I'm sorry.
She did not have to die. Jackie did not have to die. My question to you, in the aftermath of her death, several egregious actions were taken. No immediate assessment, and you may have heard this already, of her health situation when she got off the bus. No understanding of the indigenous language of her dad. He did not speak Spanish eloquently. We have no indigenous language speakers down there. We have no medical or medevac team on the ground. These are human beings. My first question, what actions have been taken to acknowledge that these are human beings, a 7-year-old girl that did not have to die? This is a servant of the United States. I imagine there are many other things that this servant of the United States could do than to empty gallons of water that might have been life-saving for individuals that are coming across the border. What do we do about this action? Number 3, is there a stated policy to distract and deter individuals from the legal ports of entry, which undermines their asylum claims under this administration? As my time ticks, let me give you these questions for writing, please. Is the Secret Service discrimination lawsuit settled? I'd like to know what is the status of the Secret Service lawsuit. I also want to understand the status of written you letters. I would like to present them to your staff right now. The Shiloh Treatment Center that has been accused of abuse of immigrant children. And I also want to understand what you're doing about Southwest Keys, of whom I do not want in my district, who I respect that they are there, combined with HHS, but we have 12,000 children in immigrant status, and they are there because I understand that the people coming to receive them are being arrested when they come there. Answer the question about Jackie, medevac, and answer the questions about the 3 first questions that I gave you. The others I'd like to have in writing.
Okay, so as to your first question, just to put this in perspective, this is exactly why we try to encourage the migrants to go to a port of entry. Unfortunately, they arrived in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. We had 3 or 4 of our CBP agents encounter a group of 161. As the father told our officers in the consulate, he did indicate at first that there was no health issue. We had no reason to believe otherwise. As soon as he indicated there was a health issue, we did what we could do as quickly as possible to get her to medical care. As you know, CBP did revive her twice, and then we brought her to the hospital because of the medevac and the space limitations. We separately transported her father, but the men and women of CBP did everything they could do.
You need to give me the time lapse between, and also acknowledge, do you have indigenous speakers? Because he did not speak Spanish effectively. Do you have indigenous speakers, and what was the time lapse between the time that you acknowledged that she was ill?
The time
She had not had water.
The time of the gentlewoman has expired.
But can
The
she finish
Secretary can answer the question.
We did, ma'am, help her as soon as the father raised the concern, in that case that she was vomiting. We were still an hour and a half away from any sort of infrastructure, whether we had called in a medevac or whether we drove her to a port of entry where there was full medical care. So we took her as quickly as possible to medical providers. But again, this is a part of the border that's in the middle of nowhere. It's just, it's one of those things, because we look at between the ports of entry, there luckily were CBP agents there. If CBP agents had not been there, it is unlikely they would have even have been able to provide the care that they did. The second one was the picture. I apologize, I have no idea what that's a picture of, but
Pouring out water.
Happy to get back to you.
This is an agent pouring out water that is...
Yes, out of context, I have no idea what it is, but happy to get back to you. And the third one is, I think, on deterrence. No, we would like everybody to be able to make any legitimate claim they have under our laws.
Thank
They
you.
have to enter the points of
The
entry.
time of the gentleman has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas,
Thank you.
Mr. Gomert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for being here. It grieves me for anyone that's part of this committee to slander you and be remorseless when they make slanderous comments about you are mean-spirited people in the administration that simply want to enforce the law. I don't hear any of that kind of outrage on behalf of victims of crime, including children who are victims of crime, for people who have come in illegally, including in sanctuary cities. But for the record, I would like to know, were children separated from the person accompanying them, alleged to be parents, during the Obama administration?
Yes, sir.
And you're saying that under oath because it's true, correct?
Yes, sir.
And on behalf of, someone who knows, I'm always glad to fill in the gaps in people's knowledge or ignorance in a particular area. So let me just state for those who are not aware, since I've worked in most areas of our criminal justice system, parents are separated from children every single day of every year, year after year, when a parent, when there's probable cause to believe a parent has committed a crime. I've signed countless warrants. Judges all over the country do it every day, and parents who have probable cause they committed a crime are separated from their children, and those are usually U.S. citizens. It's what happens when a parent is believed to have committed a crime. Mueller did it, and I know he's a hero to some folks around here. He did it to Manafort, separated him from his two beautiful children. It happens. Now, you mentioned that asylum is actually only found to be appropriate in about 10%, is that right, of the people that claim asylum?
Yes, sir.
And for my colleague who left, if Mary and Joseph were trying to come into the United States under the situation that existed, and King Herod was trying to kill everybody under 2, wouldn't they be eligible for asylum in the United States?
Yes.
Yeah, so he can scratch that from his concerns. They'd get into the United States. Have children been found to be in the custody of people who were not only not their parents, but who were child predators?
Yes, sir.
And that's a fact, isn't it?
That's a fact.
And that's one of your concerns when you separate children, when you're not sure if this is a predator or a parent, or in some cases a parent predator, correct?
Yes, sir. There's 3 instances, long-standing practice, when an adult accompanying a child is a threat to that child, as you're describing. When the parent accompanying the child is not a parent at all, there's no familiar relationship. And then if the parent has committed a crime and needs to be taken to a criminal setting, we're not going to bring the child with that parent to jail.
And I can tell you, as a witness, I have been on the border in southwest of McAllen at 2, 3 in the morning with a long line of people being questioned from the other end when people were trying to decide which one of them was going to take custody of a little child and claim that child as their own. There was no way to know who that child really belonged to, and I sympathize with the efforts of trying to figure that out and appreciate what you're trying to do. It's amazing, though, you said if someone is detained as claiming asylum, they get a decision within 40 days on average. If they're not detained, do you say over 1,200 days?
1,300.
1,300 days. Would it help, and I realize the immigration judges are under control of DOJ, but Jeff Sessions has mentioned he thought we ought to get those judges right there on the border where people get an immediate hearing. Would that be something that would be helpful to DHS and to you're being even more considerate than you already are for those coming across illegally?
Yes, sir. So that's something we've been working on with now Acting Attorney General Whitaker. We used to call them port courts, but the concept is to either have the judges right there or to provide civets capability so that we don't lose time in transporting, that we're able to immediately adjudicate the claim.
Okay, and just so it's not thankless, thank you for your service.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, I've supported a procedure for having our troops in Syria and removed from Syria, which we have not engaged in. And I'm now concerned, as are many, many, many Senate Republicans and experts in defense, about the abrupt and chaotic withdrawal that we are seeing in Syria that could be a threat to our service members, our allies, and Americans both at home and abroad. And first, I'd like to know, were you consulted before the President decided to announce this withdrawal?
No, sir, I was not as the Secretary of Homeland Security, no.
To your knowledge, were members of the NSC consulted before he decided to announce his withdrawal?
That's my understanding, sir.
So your understanding that they were or were not?
My understanding is they were.
They were. Do you know who he consulted and when?
I don't, sir. You'd have to, if I could, I'd love to defer you to the White House or the Department of Defense.
Do you have any reason to believe ISIS has been defeated and no longer poses a threat to America?
We have had extensive success, as you know, in removing their physical caliphate in Syria. But of course, we continue, from my perspective and my portfolio, we continue to worry about those who might be inspired.
Let me ask you about hate crimes in America. According to the FBI reporting, hate crimes increased by 17% last year. Almost 60% of over 7,100 hate crimes reported were motivated by race or ethnicity. Anti-Semitic hate crimes rose by 27%. We've seen the President make statements such as there were fine people on each side in Charlottesville when there were Klansmen and neo-Nazis demonstrating, protesting, and screaming, "Jews will not take our jobs," and "blood and soil." The President has used code words, talking about George Soros, that we all know conjures up code words about Jews that are globalists, that are internationalists, that are money lenders or financiers and on the national level. And we know that Timothy McVeigh drew much of his ideology from the Turner Diaries, which was based on anti-Semitic thought that Jews were controlling things. Based on all of those facts, is it not difficult to believe that the President's amplification of hateful messaging has led to more hate crimes?
Sir, what I can tell you is that from a DHS perspective, hate is hate, violence is violence. We have, in conjunction and following through with the new National Counterterrorism Strategy, we have expanded all of our prevention programs to look at all types of hate and violence throughout the United States. We work very closely with religious communities, but frankly, this needs a full holistic approach, and that's what we're looking to do. So there's the prevention programs, there's the awareness, there's the response, there's the engagement, but it has to be comprehensive because we cannot stand for any type of violence.
And does part of that comprehensive approach maybe go to Melania Trump's anti-bullying campaign? And would not America be a more tolerant and less hateful and less hate-inspired crimes occur if the President did not advocate cops grabbing people and beating them up and advocating violence oftentimes like lock her up or get that one and hit them in the head? Does that not contribute to hate crimes and encouraging people to engage in behavior? There was a guy on an airplane just recently who fondled a woman, and he said, "The President can do it, why shouldn't I?" before they kicked him off the plane. Do you not agree that certain activities and speech the President has engaged in has made it more difficult for you to do your job?
What I can tell you, sir, is sitting here today, robust discussion is at the heart of what it means to be a democracy. Casting unfounded dispersions on a secretary who's sitting before you trying to do her job is not helpful. So I refer to your colleague.
I'm referring to our President.
I don't have any of those statements in front of me. What I can tell you is what just occurred.
You heard the President say that there were fine people on each side when neo-Nazis and Klansmen marched and said, "Jews will not take our jobs," and "blood and soil."
Sir, what I can tell you is hate, violence is violence. At our department, we are looking to counter and prevent
And let me
all of
ask you
that.
this. Shortly after the Dallas police shooting by a lone sniper, DHS and the FBI circulated emails saying that there was a threat of black supremacist extremists attempting to violently co-opt the upcoming conventions. However, other government documents take a different approach when assessing the threat of white supremacist groups. Can you explain to this committee why the administration takes a different approach to persons of color, like Black Lives Matter, than it does to white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and Klansmen with a well-documented history of violence and hatred and death and killings of Americans?
We do not take a different approach at DHS. Hate is hate, violence is violent. Our programs are comprehensive.
Thank you, ma'am. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. Thank you for giving succinct, direct answers. I appreciate that. Thank you for your service. When I was a district attorney and a U.S. attorney, when we arrested people for violence, for drugs, for breaking the law, many of them had children. And we had to make sure that that person was arrested, and we made sure that those children were put in a safe, healthy place, like you have been doing. We didn't let the person go because they had children. That's absurd. So I agree with what you've been doing in the policy, and I've been following it closely because I have a special place in my heart, like many of us here on this committee do, for children. My children are adopted. I was a foster parent. I'm a big brother, the whole 9 yards. I've worked with Homeland Security when I was a U.S. attorney for many years. I have the utmost respect for the people that work at Homeland Security. They are professionals, and they are a credit to our agency. I'm embarrassed by the performance that was done here a little bit ago that was called you a liar, and that you were not remorseful and you were unsympathetic. It's just, it's uncalled for, it's ungentlemanly, and it's nothing more than grandstanding. Most of us do not act that way. So I apologize for that behavior. It's nothing more than playing up to the cameras that are here in this room. One of my best, closest friends on the other side, Karen Bass, and I spend a lot of time working with children in foster care and adoptions, and we're going to continue to do that. Just please make sure that Homeland Security people continue to follow the rules, to do what they can to provide health care and feed and protect these children. But we cannot continue to let people into this country without knowing who's coming into the country. Again, as a prosecutor, I prosecuted terrorists, and I know how they got into this country, and we prevented a great deal from occurring. That I wish we could tell the American people, but there are just certain things law enforcement cannot divulge. And I'm sure that's the same thing that happens in Homeland Security. I'm not going to hold pictures up here of somebody dumping something that we have no idea what it is. I'm not going to pay too much attention to, well, I heard this or someone told me that. I deal in facts as a prosecutor. What I do want to ask you is, what can we do here in Congress to make sure that you have the tools, and please don't hesitate to tell us what tools you need to continue to secure the borders, protect people who are in this country, Americans who are here legally, and by the same token, have a process whereby we can have individuals who want to come into this country legally. We do it in, hopefully, a more efficient and effective manner.
Yes, sir. So again, the goals here are to have a safe and orderly flow. The goal is to protect those who are seeking asylum. It cannot be that the way that we do that is we force them to pay a smuggler and trafficker and put themselves at risk. So I will continue to work with the Northern Triangle countries, with Mexico, to help vulnerable populations as soon as possible. From Congress, I would ask for wall. We need wall. We also need to change some of the outdated laws to reflect the current flow.
Could I ask you to, when you say wall, explain to the American people what that means, because of I know the high-tech systems that we're attempting to implement as well.
Yes. So it's a wall system. It's a physical infrastructure, physical barrier, but as you say, it also is very important that it goes hand in hand with the technology and the personnel. So the second request is going to be for personnel. We do need additional folks within CBP, ICE, and USCIS that will help us ensure that this flow is processed as quickly as possible and also in a safe and orderly way. And there's lots of other things we can go into the Homeland. But the last one is to change the laws so that they reflect the current flow. For example, back when TVPRA was passed, the vast majority of migrants were Mexican. Now that is no longer true. So to treat a child from Mexico differently than a child from other countries no longer makes sense. They need to apply equally. We need to be able to protect them the same.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Bass, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me follow with my colleague, Mr. Marino. As he mentioned, the two of us have worked for many years to improve our nation's child welfare system. And I mean, no disrespect to you, but I do want to focus my questions on that. And I went to the border. I spent time in McAllen, and I met with a number of families who had had their children separated from them. Some of the families were told that they were just going to go to a court hearing and they would have their kids afterwards, and then they found out they didn't. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, what would make a parent ineligible to receive their child back? When I asked that of the border agents, they gave me an example of a parent who had been convicted of a DUI, and that made that parent then ineligible to have their children returned to them. So I wanted to know if you could give me examples of when a parent would be ineligible to have their children returned.
So the suitability determinations under the law are actually made by the Department of Health and Human Services. I know what they look at is whether or not a other potential sponsor could be a threat in any way to the child.
No, but this is reunification with a parent who is there, not a sponsor.
Well, okay, so I'm not sure what you're talking about. If we're talking about when we separate, if the parent is not a parent.
No, I'm talking about when the parent is a parent.
Okay, so if the parent is a parent, the only time at which that parent would be separated at this time is if they are a threat to the child or if they've committed another crime.
So there are a number of children who were separated from their parents who have not been reunified. Some of those parents have been deported. And their families were told, the lucky ones that know where the child is, was told that they then are responsible for the costs of flying the child back to the home country. Is that still true?
Every parent who was deported did have the option to bring their child or children with them. And in every case...
So these were the children that were separated?
Yes, ma'am. I mean? Every parent had the choice to bring the child back with them when they were removed. The ones who did not bring the children with them made the choice not to have the child accompany them.
And so I do have to say, in all honesty, I have a difficulty believing that a parent would just say, leave the child there. But we know of cases where the parent has not does not know where the child is because the child has been separated, or has been told that they have to bear the costs of reunification. If you're not aware of it, it's fine. I'm just asking you.
No, I appreciate it. On the cost, I'll get right back to you, but I would just direct you to the Miss L case. So in great detail, it does give the numbers of the parents who chose to leave their children in the United States, did not want them removed with them. So let me get you the exact numbers, but that's all in the Miss L case. With respect to the transportation costs for those who might then have decided they do in fact want their children with them, I will get back to you on that.
So we also have been told, and when I was at the border saw this, that if you are not a biological mother or father, but a grandmother, an aunt, or an uncle, that is not considered family and that those children were separated.
There is no, to my understanding, we'll double check and get back to you. There is certainly no blanket decision that I'm aware of that would require that.
So the background checks that are done, and I'm sorry, the reason why I'm interrupting is because I'm going to run out of time.
Then I'll respond.
So the background checks that are done of families in order for the child to be reunified.
Yes.
background checks are way behind, if they're even attempted at all, of the staff in some of these facilities that have been up and running in a very fast manner. So what is the response to that in terms of the background checks?
So I'm happy to get you an answer from HHS. We don't run those facilities, so I just don't have that information with me.
So my colleagues have asked me to read a note. This is a statement from Representative Gomez. During a visit to the U.S. border this week to observe how the Trump administration is treating migrant families in a humane and lawful manner, they witnessed a situation where the families did not have toilet facilities and were given a bucket. And I was wondering if you could explain to me how a situation like that occurs, where they're not even able to have porta potties.
I don't have any information on that. I don't know where on the border that was. I don't know if it was at a port facility.
That was the Otay Mesa port of entry. And these were people that had presented themselves for asylum, so they were not crossing the border illegally. They were trying to abide with the law.
Okay, so ma'am, I don't have the facts on that case, but there's no Border Patrol agent, if there are facilities nearby, that is going to give someone a bucket.
Did you receive the letter from the AMA and the American Academy of Pediatrics on the problem, the long-term damage of separating children from their families?
The time of the gentlewoman has expired.
Can I ask for unanimous consent to enter the AAP and AMA statements into the committee record?
Without objection, they will be made a part of the record, and the witness may answer the question.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, what I would just say is that I share the Congresswoman's concern about children. I think the problem is that we have 70,000 this year who were sent here unaccompanied at the hands, in most cases, of smugglers and traffickers who abuse them. I'm very concerned about that, and I will continue to work to ensure that children are not put in that position before they even get to the United States, where we take very good care of them.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Madam Secretary, I think you're doing a great job in very difficult circumstances, because as a country, we have not extinguished the magnets that draw people across our border illegally, and that we go and task you with the obligation of securing a border without the adequate resources, without the adequate physical infrastructure, and then under protocols that at times are very difficult to execute. If you tell people that if they show up with kids, they're going to be treated less harshly, then more people are going to show up with kids. Can you cite examples of where children in Central and South America have been put in jeopardy by the policies of our country that allow people to be treated differently if they arrive with minor children?
Yes, and I'm happy to get you more specific statistics, but just to use these last caravans as examples, we heard directly from the governments of the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, that there were kidnappings as part of this caravan, so that an adult could take a child under the impression that if they had a child, they could come and get into the United States and be let go.
I've also met with officials from Guatemala and Honduras, and they've shared with me stories of circumstances where human traffickers and caravan organizers would place children at the front in the most precarious of circumstances in harm's way. Do you have a reason to dispute those reports, or have you seen the same thing?
I've seen the same thing, sir, and unfortunately I've seen the heart-wrenching videos, both of what occurred at the southern border of Mexico as well as our southern border.
I'm going to change topics to drugs. When drugs move across the border illegally, can you speak to the ways in which that creates a more violent and less safe and destabilized environment on the border?
Yes, of course, and particularly in places where there's no wall. So there'll be stash houses on either side in those areas. RGV is one example. There's a tremendous amount of increased violence because of the criminal activity that goes hand in hand with the distribution of drugs.
So it would seem if the movement of drugs across our border contributes to violence and destabilization, we would want less of that activity occurring. I would cite an IG report on the Customs and Border Protection that says that during 2017, there were 857,888 pounds of marijuana seized. Do you have any reason to disagree with that assessment?
Yes, I don't have a reason to dispute that number.
And actually, that sounds pretty large. That's actually about the same weight as 2 statues of liberty. And I was surprised that that's actually a number that's down from 2005, it's actually down 336,539 pounds. And so is it accurate in your assessment that the amount of marijuana that we're seizing at the border has reduced rather significantly since 2005?
Marijuana has gone down. We do see increases in fentanyl through the mail, as you know, from China.
I'm focusing
yes,
specifically
marijuana has gone down,
on
yes.
cannabis, and that same IG report that reviewed the work of your agency concluded the decrease, and I'm quoting directly here, the decrease in marijuana seizures correlates to the decrease in demand since the legalization of marijuana in states in the U.S. Do you agree or disagree with that assessment?
I just haven't seen it, sir. So what I can tell you is other drugs have gone up.
Yeah, no, but my question is, do you, as you sit before us, do you have a basis to disagree with the Inspector General's assessment that the decrease in marijuana being seized is a consequence of state-based decisions to legalize medical cannabis?
The demand is down, the flow is down. I'm happy to look at specifically what he said.
And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to also include in the record a Cato Institute report that says specifically state-level marijuana legalization has undercut the demand for illegal Mexican marijuana.
Without objection, be made a part of the record.
And so if smuggling drugs across the border leads to violence and instability, and if states legalizing medical cannabis reduces the demand and reduces the likelihood that illegal Mexican marijuana will come into our country, does the Department of Homeland Security have a viewpoint on whether or not the federal government ought to use our extreme powers to crush legal medical cannabis laws in our several states?
I'm happy to look at the IG report, sir, and come speak with you. Apologize, I'm just not familiar with
but like
that.
if you let me represent you.
We need to get drugs down.
Yeah, well, I get that we need to get drugs down, but there seems to be like disagreement, particularly among those that are on my side of the aisle, as to how to do that. Some think that state-based marijuana is a gateway drug and makes people want illicit products more, but the people who've looked at your agency, and you've got this very difficult job, are saying that if states have the ability to innovate and make legal, high-quality medical cannabis available to people, then we're not going to have as difficult a job for you and for your Border Patrol agents and for the people who live across our border. So I would ask you to contemplate that, and perhaps it's something that the department would take a more active role in going forward. I appreciate the chairman's indulgence, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Trump administration is demanding $5 billion for a wall on our southern border. Is that correct?
The president has asked for $5 billion, yes.
Now, that's $5 billion of American taxpayer dollars. Is that correct?
He has asked for a $5 billion appropriation, yes.
Right. Now, a government shutdown is a serious thing, true?
Absolutely.
Yet the Trump administration plans to shut down our government in the absence of a $5 billion allocation for the border wall. Is that correct?
I believe the president is actively negotiating right now.
Didn't the president say that he would own a shutdown if he did not receive $5 billion in American taxpayer money?
Again, I've been here this morning. I understand there's been a lot of activity since the passage last evening, but what I understand your question, and what I would say is he is committed to getting $5 billion.
Okay, it was just a yes or no question, and I think it played out before the American people and the world. Now, Secretary Nielsen, you also believe that our government should be shut down in the absence of a $5 billion allocation of American taxpayer dollars. Is that correct?
I've never said that, no, sir. I think that we need border security and we need a wall, and we need to find a way to fund the wall.
So you disagree with the president's position?
No, sir. I think he is continuing to negotiate. He has said that he will get the money one way or another, and he is looking at a variety of ways to do that, as I understand.
The president has repeatedly stated that Mexico would pay for the wall. Is that correct?
He has said that.
So I guess I'm confused. If Mexico is going to pay for the border wall, why is the Trump administration and your Department of Homeland Security petitioning Congress for $5 billion in American taxpayer money to pay for that same wall?
All I can tell you from my perspective is why we need a wall, how much wall we need, and where we're going to build it.
But you're the Secretary of Homeland Security, and it's your department that is asking the American taxpayer for $5 billion to pay for a wall that you just acknowledged President Trump has said Mexico would pay for? I'm confused. Can you help me?
Yeah,
and
I think
maybe
the
help my
most,
constituents through that
I
confusion?
think most recently what the president has said is that border security remains national security, and he is looking at every way possible to fund the wall that we need. What I do is I tell him where we need wall, how much we need, how we're going to build it, what the operational constraints are, et cetera.
Now, you've had a change of position as it relates to the wall, is that correct?
I have.
Have you had a change of position as it relates to your support for a wall?
Don't believe so, no.
Okay, so I believe that you testified during your Senate confirmation hearings on November 8th of 2017, is that right?
I testified around that time.
Right. And that testimony was given under oath, is that right?
Believe so.
So I think during your confirmation hearing, you stated that it was not your plan to, quote, build a wall from sea to shining sea on our southern border, correct?
Sir, that has not changed. The president has said the same. That is not our plan. We don't need it everywhere. In some places, the environmental factors are such that they provide their own impedance and denial, so a physical infrastructure is not necessary there.
Okay. Let me just say in the time that I've got remaining, switching topics, what is happening on the southern border is, as it relates to children and vulnerable parents and people who are fleeing incredibly rough conditions, particularly from Central America and Northern Triangle countries, which are amongst some of the most violent in the world, is unconscionable, it's un-American, it's unacceptable. We are a nation of immigrants, a gorgeous mosaic of people from throughout the world. We are black, we are white, we are Latino, we are Asian, we are Native American, we are Jewish, we are Muslim, we are Christian, we're young, we're old, we're gay, we're straight, we're citizens, we're dreamers. Consistent with the founding of this country, out of many, we are one. And I just want to make clear that notwithstanding whatever xenophobic behavior has been coming out of Washington over the last 2 years, our diversity is a strength, it is not a weakness, and on January 3rd, everything will change. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I would just say again, that is why the best way to address this problem is to help those vulnerable populations as soon as possible. So we've worked extensively with Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries. As you know, Mexico is now offering asylum. They're offering work permits. It should not be that if you do have a fear that you have to travel thousands and thousands and thousands of miles to get somebody to help you. The region as a whole has to pull it together and help these vulnerable populations as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. And the chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for 5 minutes.
And what I want to say here is, before we get going, I want to say that it's odd to me that the intolerant demand tolerance, the uncivil demand civility, the intractable demand compromise, the impolite demand respectful behavior, those who hurl ad hominem attacks demand professional conduct from others, and sometimes even the lawless demand the rule of law. And so I think I've just been astonished by what some of the comments that have been directed to you personally and to the men and women of ICE and CBP today. I'm outraged by that, and it's unfortunate. I have spoken out of this hearing. I went and called some of my friends who are Border Patrol agents to say, what's going on? Anything new happened today? Well, a group of 64 was apprehended in southern Arizona last night. Another Border Patrol agent was attacked and assaulted by a Honduran who bit the agent, punched the agent in the stomach, and then assaulted them, split their head open with a rock. This is what we have at the border. It is a crisis. These agents, these men and women who go down to the border and defend us, they deserve respect and consideration, not hurled insults and just this absolute disrespect for what they do and the disrespect for the rule of law which we have in America. So I want to speak to asylum seekers in Mesa. So according to some news reports, more than 4,000 Central American people who entered the country illegally, who were not part of the caravan, who declared they were seeking asylum were released by ICE into the Phoenix metro area between October 12th and November 30th. The report indicated that these people were released with ankle monitoring bracelets and paperwork. They were free to go anywhere they chose to go. My question regarding these 4,000 people being released into the Phoenix metro area is, do you know what type of vetting is done of these individuals before they are released into our communities?
Sir, this is an unfortunate consequence of capacity. As you know, with families under the Flores settlement, we can only hold them for 21 days. So unfortunately, they do have to be released. The difficulty with the ATD is we find that 30% of family members that have ATD cut them off. They abscond. So then we lose track. We have to then go find them. The other thing I would just say, as I mentioned before, is not only is it more expensive to use that than detention, but in fact, it lengthens the period substantially. So we go from 40 days to 1,300 days to be able to get them through the process.
Well, thanks. You anticipated my next question, which was, how long does it normally take for these folks to be processed? And I guess my question would be, how many of these people, I think the number I heard last week is that there's, I want to say roughly 700,000 of these people, folks that are running around that have court dates who have requested asylum, and how many of them abscond completely that drop off, we don't ever see them again?
So 40% we find do not file the application after they go through the initial credible fear process. So they're welcome into the United States. They never finish the application. They largely disappear unless we have the ability to detain them briefly, but with families, we don't. 31% are not present at their hearing. So after we schedule the date to give them the opportunity to receive the asylum they claim they need, they do not show for the court case. So it's a difficult situation. We want to protect those who legitimately need asylum, but we need to cut back on the fraud and the others who misunderstand our laws so that we can protect vulnerable populations, but that we can also protect American communities.
So, different topic. CBP set a goal for 2018 to have biometric exit in at least one airport. Is working with airlines and airports on strategies to use these public-private partnerships to reduce costs and give industry more control over how a biometric exit capability is implemented at airport gates. And I'm wondering, what is the status of implementation of the biometric exit?
So we expect to have exit fully implemented at all airports in 4 years. We have a strategy for the land border, and we have a public-private partnership with the cruise lines so that we can also do it in the maritime domain.
Great. And last thing is, I hope to be able to meet with you because I have loads more questions and I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, did I understand you correctly to say that as you sit here today, you do not know how many human beings have died while in the custody of the department that you lead? And you, in preparation for today's hearing, you didn't ascertain that number, but you don't know it today?
I don't have an exact figure for you.
Do you have a rough idea?
Sir, what I can tell you
I'm
is...
talking about people who have died in your custody. You don't have the number?
I will get back to you with the number.
Okay. You've also said, in talking about the Flores decision, that it's a loophole. And in your written testimony, you called it burdensome court opinions. You do recognize that those opinions are based on constitutional protections, do you not?
The reference in the testimony was to a whole variety of court cases.
I'm talking about your written testimony where you spoke about Flores as a burdensome court opinion. Those may impose some burdens on you because the Constitution protects liberty and puts limitations on when the government can detain people.
Sir, the Constitution does not say that families can only be detained for 20 days.
That's what the Flores decision says, and it's based on the Constitution, is it not? And it's a law that you're required to follow, correct? You took an oath.
The Flores settlement...
Are you required to follow that
law? Would you like me to answer the question, or you want to just yell at me? Because it's up to you.
I'm asking you.
And I'm trying to answer it, so would you like to hear it?
That you respect and honor in the work of the department. That's a yes or a no.
The Flores settlement requires us to write a regulation, which we have, and it's out for public comment. We are following the law to the letter.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. You've also said repeatedly and again today that there is no department policy for separation of children. You remember you just said that?
Yes, sir. There is no
Now,
comprehensive policy to separate
you remember,
families.
of course, that we came to receive through a Freedom of Information Act request from Open Government, a memorandum that was written to you on April 23, 2018. You've seen this memo, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, it gives you a bunch of options that the department can engage in. And the final option, option 3, says, and I quote, DHS could also permissively direct the separation of parents or legal guardians and minors held in immigration detention so that the parent or legal guardian can be prosecuted pursuant to these authorities. You remember reading that?
We have the authority to do that, yes.
That would be child and it goes on to say zero tolerance. This is that president used that term, zero tolerance, right? Do you remember reviewing that?
I do, but you're confusing a variety of topics, which I'm happy to walk you through.
And then in the memo, they ask someone, I assume it's the secretary, to pick one of the options. And option 3 is redacted. My first question is that your signature affirming option 3?
I can't see that, and I don't remember which it is, but the option that I agreed to is that we would uphold the law equally against anybody who broke it. If you were single or if
Madam
you were a
Secretary, I have
parent.
limited time. Option 3 in this memo, written for you, which this is signed, option 3, which is redacted, option 3 is in fact, the option that was provided to you that I just read, permissively directing the separation of parents or legal guardians and minors held in immigration detention. So although you've said, and this isn't a question, it's a statement, although you've claimed publicly that you didn't know anything about a family separation policy and you tweeted about it, you signed off on a memo authorizing this practice described as zero tolerance. Whether you think it's legal or not, you authorize it. And so this notion that you have no responsibility for it, you reviewed it, it was offered to you as one of 3 options, you picked it. This is what it results in, because I went to the border. This is a disgrace that belies our values as a country. And to see those children and have spoken to them and to spoken to their parents who didn't know where their children were, this doesn't reflect who we are. And I find the suggestion that it was sort of something you didn't know about when you've signed off on a memo authorizing it, a policy which does violence to our basic founding values and to our understanding that children do best when not separated from their children. And so I would ask Madam Secretary, when we passed the fiscal 19 authorization bill, there were 15 amendments that were made law that involved family separation that require the agency to do a number of things, including regular reporting, mental health services, a number of prohibitions. Are you familiar with those amendments that were passed into law and signed by this Congress?
There were amendments passed into law, yes, sir. I can't
So
verbatim
I would
say what
ask
they
you,
are.
will you commit to give me a written response as to the status of every one of those requirements that we passed and the president signed? Because my understanding is none of them have happened.
Happy to give you a status.
Thank you. And to be clear, Madam Secretary, my outrage is not at you. It's at this policy and this administration's behavior as it relates to our responsibility to continue to be a place that people can come to seek asylum, to seek refuge, to seek protection. It is the crown jewel of our immigration policy, and it has been diminished, and it has betrayed American values in the way that it's been executed. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that this article, newly uncovered memo suggests Kirstjen Nielsen lied to Congress about family separation, be made a part of the record.
Will be made, without objection, made
I'd
part
ask
of the
that
record.
this article, transgender immigrant who died in ICE custody was beaten and deprived of medical attention, family says, as
Objection,
part of the
made
record.
part of the record.
I'd ask that this report entitled Trump's 10 Cities Are an Enormous Waste of Money, There Are Better Options, be included as part of the record.
Without objection, be made a part of the record.
This article, The Final Hours of Jacqueline Calmacan, the Guatemalan girl who died in Border Patrol custody, be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
I'd ask that this article, Where Family Separation Began, a case in El Paso shows Flores is the solution, not the problem, be made a part of the record.
I just said it without
Thank you.
objection.
I'd ask this article called Careless Cruelty. Civil servants said separating families was illegal. The administration ignored us. Be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
I'd ask that this article entitled Families Are Still Being Separated at the Border Months After Zero Tolerance Was Reversed. Be made part of the record.
Without objection.
I'd ask that this article entitled Trump Administration Weighs New Family Separation Effort at Border. Be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
That this article, U.S. Still Separating Families at the Border When Children Are U.S. Citizens. Be made part of the record. And a report just last night or 2 nights ago from ABC News, Dying for Salvation, a detained migrant's desperate plea for medical attention, a father of 6 children who died in the custody of the United States government be made a part of the record.
Without objection, time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, recognized for 5 minutes.
If I could, if you don't mind, sir, what I'd like to put into the record, and I'll get you the numbers, is every single migrant that the Customs and Border Patrol agents saved. I'd like to put in the record every single migrant that the Coast Guard has saved. I would like to put into the record all the communities that ICE protects by pulling child exploiters, smugglers, and traffickers off of the street. I would like to put in the monumental decrease in the opioid epidemic thanks to the good men and women of DHS. I would like to put in a variety of comments about the misunderstanding of parts of this committee, the difference between a policy and a law. Our policy never changed. It's the same as it was in Obama. There's 3 reasons that there is a separation. 1, the parent is going to do harm to the child.
Where you go to that without objection? Those
Thank you, appreciate it.
We'll start the clock back, I'm sure, for my questions. Madam Secretary, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your service for such a time as this. And thank you for being willing to answer the questions. You're doing a great job, and there are great men and women at DHS. We know that. We're grateful for them and Border Security, Border Patrol. I was noticing the exhibit that my colleague, Mr. Cicilline, just used, and I noticed something about that. Isn't it true that those very same Mylar blankets, the chain link, perimeter fencing, identical conditions, were all present and used during the Obama administration?
Yes, sir.
So for all we know then, Mr. Cicilline's exhibit photo could have been taken any time in the past 10 years, isn't that right?
Yes, matter of fact, we've seen many, many videos in the news that were actually not in the last 2 years, but were from the prior administration.
Let me ask you a couple questions. With the recent influx of illegal border crossings, do you believe that statutory changes are needed to enhance the process of assessing what constitutes credible fear, which we've talked about a lot today?
Yes, I do.
Do you believe the increase in individuals attempting to cross the border illegally to claim credible fear is a result of a lack of enforcement by previous administrations?
I think it serves as a pull factor, yes, sir. If there's no consequence to illegal behavior, the illegal behavior will continue.
I just want to say for the record here, I appreciate your testimony this morning that you said in your own words, and I wrote it down as a quote, we have a real, serious, and sustained crisis at our border, and you said walls work. And I want you to know that the vast majority of my constituents in Louisiana agree with and understand that, and we appreciate your service on it. And speaking of Louisiana, the Cyber Innovation Center in one of my cities in Bossier City, Louisiana, has made a significant advancement in preparing future generations for STEM-related careers. For example, the National Integrated Cyber Education Research Center was developed by the Cyber Innovation Center there to address the growing need for cyber-based curricula. And the development was largely based on the Cybersecurity Education and Training Assistance Program, or CTAP, initiated by DHS. As you know, our nation's cybersecurity infrastructure is reliant upon our ability to train members of our workforce to obtain the necessary skills which make them capable of stopping evolving cyber threats. Could you just describe real briefly the funding and strategy behind your STEM workforce pipeline program?
Sure. So this is, as you say, just very briefly, a very important area. The cyber threat continues to grow, and because we're all interconnected, unfortunately, we're at a place where your risk is mine, mine is yours. So we all have to work together to remove that weakest link. The idea of all of our initiatives right now is, first of all, to provide a variety of curriculums for all levels of education. You can find those, as you know, on our website. We work very closely with centers of excellence, such as the ones in your state. Thank you for your partnership. But the goal is to bring more and more children and students into the workforce. Hopefully, some will choose to come to DHS. We would love their expertise. But regardless, it's very important that the generations of the future understand cybersecurity so that they can build it into everything that they do.
I appreciate you saying that, and it really is a dilemma because in spite of all these efforts to resolve it, there's still a workforce shortage in this area. And a lot of the jobs appear to be available only in the DC metro area, but we certainly want to advocate for relocating certain jobs to a state, I don't know, like Louisiana, where cyber-educated workforce and lower cost of living is a real factor to be considered. Is that something you would consider?
I would love to talk to you about that, yes, sir.
And due to the delays in, this is another subject, but due to the delays in processing security clearances for DHS contractors, have you instructed the department to review and consider any new changes that would make the process of obtaining a clearance more efficient while also ensuring, of course, accurate background checks.
Yes, so we've changed the sponsorship program, particularly with our private sector partners, so that it's much more streamlined. And then we're also working with those that adjudicate the clearances to make sure that they have all of the information they need up front. Part of the backlog was the going back and forth. So we're trying to front load all the information so the adjudication can be made faster.
Really grateful, and again, grateful to you for your service for such a time as this, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Nielsen, for being here. Have you ever taken any sort of oath of loyalty to Donald Trump?
Just to the country, sir.
So before you could become Secretary of Homeland Security, you took an oath to U.S. Constitution, correct?
When I was sworn in, yes, and many times before that.
And under the Constitution, the executive branch executes the laws, and Congress writes the laws, correct?
Yes.
So when Congress writes a law appropriating funding to your agency, you can't divert that funding to another agency without congressional authorization, correct?
We would do it by following the law.
So for example, if Congress gave disaster assistance funding to FEMA, you can't take that money, give it to the Department of Defense to build a military base in California, right?
There are legal procedures, as you know, to reprogram. That is part of what's in any given appropriation. But yes, sir, we would do it by the law, whatever the law requires.
And similarly, the Department of Defense couldn't take money we gave to them for fighter jets and then divert it to you to build a wall, correct?
They would do it under the law, sir.
So if Congress specifically has not authorized a wall nor appropriated a wall, the Department of Defense can't give you money to build a wall, isn't that right?
I can't speak to Department of Defense authorities. Some of their pockets of money, similar to any department, do have some flexibility in how they can be spent and for what purposes. Sometimes the missions will overlap, but I'd have to defer you to the Department of Defense.
Are you aware of any authority that will let the Department of Defense give money to you to build a wall?
My understanding is there could be some pockets of money that could be considered for that use.
If you could let us know what you think that would be. Because my understanding is there is currently no appropriation for a wall, which is why the president is looking at doing a partial government shutdown. That's the whole point of it. So I'd like to talk about family separations. And you earlier during the hearing said basically you sort of took umbrage at being called a liar. So I won't use that phrase. But I will say that you're not telling the truth about family separation. And it's because your boss, Donald Trump, did a whole executive order reversing the policy of family separation. So I'd like unanimous consent to put in the record article in the Washington Post dated June 20th, 2018 with the title, Trump reverses course, signs order ending policy of separating families at the border. I'm also going to read you some of the things he says. So we're going to have strong, very strong borders, but we're going to keep their families together, Trump said as he signed the order in the Oval Office. I didn't like the sight or the feeling of families being separated. So these little boys and girls, they didn't self-separate. Your agency ripped them away from their parents. And then after Trump reverses on this family separation policy, because clearly you can't reverse a law, executive orders only reverse policy, your agency then had to spend a lot of time trying to reunite these little kids with their parents. So I would just appreciate if you started telling the truth to American people about the policy of family separation. So
Again, sir, I would
That was not a question, that was just, you can answer after I'm done.
No problem. If you'd like to just give a speech, I'll just let me know when you're done.
I'm gonna ask you some questions now.
Wonderful.
So during your opening statement, you sort of painted this dark picture of this crisis at the border and there was crime and so on. Are you aware that in 2017, violent crime rates dropped?
Across the country or
Yes,
in a
across the
particular
country.
other country or?
FBI report, have you read it? It says violent crime rates dropped in 2017. Are you aware of that?
I have no reason to dispute the FBI.
Same report also says property crime rates dropped in 2017, according to that same report. Are you aware of that?
I have no reason to dispute the FBI.
Are you aware of the numerous reports that say immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit less crimes than native-born Americans? Are you aware of those studies?
I have not seen those particular studies.
Right, so I'd like you to go, or have your staff show you the Cato Institute study from 2014 that showed all immigrants are less likely to be incarcerated than native-born Americans relative to their share of the population. There's been a Public Policy Institute of California study that also showed that the foreign-born, who make about 35% of the adult population in California, constitute only about 17% of the adult prison population. So just be helpful if you start putting in some basic facts about the actual facts related to immigrants and crime. And then I'm just going to conclude by quoting from Congressman Will Hurd, who said essentially in a Washington Post op-ed that building a wall will be the most expensive and least effective way to secure the border. I yield back.
Sir, executive orders can direct a law enforcement official to change their prosecutorial discretion. What the executive order that the president signed was not to reverse a policy. It essentially said, despite the fact that the families are choosing to come here illegally and are breaking U.S. law, it is the policy of the United States to keep them together. Because of Flores, we are not able to keep them both together and prosecute them. So the result of that is we do not prosecute families that choose to come across the border illegally under the current executive order. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I turn to the gentleman from Idaho, I just want to make members aware, a vote series has just started. I'm going to ask one of the members on this side of the aisle to go vote quickly and come back. I want to keep this hearing going because I'd like every single member to have the opportunity to ask 5 minutes worth of questions, but the secretary also has a very hard stop coming up very soon as well. So we are working to try to get you all in, but I can't guarantee that's going to happen. And so now I turn to the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The number of apprehensions went down in 2017 at the border. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I don't think the data that was just presented to you about the number of crimes going down in 2017 actually correlates with the idea that illegal immigration does not have an effect on crimes. Isn't that correct?
I would agree. I would agree.
Yeah, so I think I would be careful with making that kind of argument in the future if I were on the other side. But you know we're in a humanitarian crisis at the southern border. We have some major issues, and currently the administration is unable to detain families together for longer than 20 days. We have issues with asylum. We have issues with all these other things. But something that touched me as I was listening to the hearing, as I was preparing for the hearing today, is this young girl who died on December 8th of this year. The reason it touched me is that on December 8th, I was celebrating my 51st birthday. And at the same time, I didn't know that this happened at the time, but at the same time that I'm with my family celebrating this occasion, you have a young girl at the border who is dying with her father there. And I don't think that I can blame the father. If I were in the father's situation, I would probably do some of the same things that he did. I would try to give my daughter the best life that he could. Do you blame the father for her death?
No, sir.
I don't think, and it would be so inappropriate to blame the USCIS or ICE or any person who works under you for the death of this girl. In fact, everything I've heard about this case, everything you testified to, was that you guys gave this young girl the best possible care that you could. Would you agree with that?
I do, yes, sir.
And in fact, you tried to save her life, isn't that right?
They revived her twice.
But there's something that we can blame for this death, and it's the current policies of the United States. The fact that the law is encouraging fathers who want to give their daughters a better life, just like I want to give my daughter a better life, to come to the United States illegally in a way that puts their family in jeopardy. It also, what we have is a policy that we have seen an increase in people coming to the United States illegally. We have seen an increase in people that are seeking asylum. And what we know is that these people are being lied to by cartels. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What are the cartels telling them about asylum?
Unfortunately, when we encounter the aliens, we hear everything from their belief that seeking a job is a reason for asylum, seeking to reunify with their family as a reason for asylum.
And they're telling you that that's what they're being told by the cartels.
What the cartels tell them is if you get to the United States, you can get in and just claim asylum. The confusion and the misinformation that they're provided, however, are the many reasons for which asylum might be granted. They also, at the same time, though, do tell them that if they claim a credible fear and use those words, that they will absolutely be given entrance to the country.
So you, as an administration, have been trying to change the policy to discourage these families from coming to the United States through illegal means. For example, you tried a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago, to change the policy so everyone would know that if you don't come through port of entry, you're not going to receive asylum, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it seems to me that the same people that are attacking you today for the death of this child and many other deaths that have occurred at the border because of people that are coming here illegally are the same people that are standing in the way of us having a safe way for people to come to the United States. Is that not true?
One death is too many.
Absolutely.
But as you say, I work every day, as do the men and women of DHS, to try to limit the perils of that journey. That journey is dangerous. The smugglers are not humanitarians. Our system should not incentivize that type of a journey and use of criminals to get here.
And in fact, today you made an announcement that there's going to be a new policy. Would this policy make it safer for these families that are trying to come to the United States? And would it make it safer for the families that actually have legitimate claims of asylum?
It will help us help them faster.
So guess who's against that policy? Again, the same people that are yelling at you today and trying to call you a liar and a criminal and all these other things. I just find that really sad. I find that really objectionable. As a person who cares about immigration and wants to have an immigration policy that works for the 21st century, I wish the other side would join us in actually having a policy and a law that allows you to do your job so we can actually bring people to the United States the proper way and we can keep people safe. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for what the men and women of Homeland Security do, and God bless.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here with us. It has been very difficult to listen to this hearing, and it has been difficult for a number of reasons, but one is that there are numerous things you have said that don't comport with the facts, and I don't know how you want to classify that, but the statement about family separation policy not being there, my colleagues have talked a lot about that. That statement that you made earned 4 Pinocchios in the fact-checking world. The statement that you made about 10% of asylum seekers having success is simply incorrect on many fronts, including that it doesn't take into account the effective legal counsel that is provided. When it's provided, those numbers go way up. If it's not provided, they go way down. The statement that you made that families were given the choice to be deported with their children and chose to leave their children behind is simply not true. Evidence presented in the court by the ACLU and judged credible by the attorney, by the judge, as well as statements from the Office of the Inspector General, make it clear that those procedures simply did not allow a meaningful way for families to weigh in. So all of that has been difficult, but equally difficult is I was the first member of Congress to actually go into a federal prison and visit twice with 276, I think, women and some men who had had their children ripped away from them, had not been able to talk to their children in weeks, did not know where their children were. And then later, I spent and those mothers talked about what they were escaping and the sacrifices they made. And later I was at the Tijuana side of the border and talking to Hondurans, a young man, Madam Secretary, who was 16, I think, who had gunshot wounds in both his knees and had fled and had taped messages on his phone from his mother saying, "You cannot come back here, you will be killed." So the idea that these are illegal immigrants, first of all, they haven't even entered the country. Secondly, many of these people are fleeing deplorable conditions in other parts of the world. And your administration actually ended a program that was the Central American Minors Program that permitted children with parents lawfully present in the United States to effectively apply for refugee status from their home country. That shut out 2,714 children who had been granted conditional approval. The Trump administration ended that program. If you're so concerned about those young people, will you commit to restarting that very effective program?
The problem with that program is, first of all, it was a categorical.
I'm sorry, I'm going to take that as a no and ask you to please give me a written answer, just so
Happy
that,
to.
just because I'm so limited on timing.
Understood.
Let me just talk about deaths in detention in private prisons. Last week, ABC News aired an investigation alleging that improper medical care in DHS detention facilities may have contributed to the death of Gerardo Cruz. Mr. Cruz entered DHS custody in full health. In the following days, he began displaying flu-like symptoms, and his condition visibly worsened over the course of a few weeks until he eventually died from complications of pneumonia. Are you aware of Mr. Cruz's story?
Yes, ma'am. I do not have all the facts in front of me, though, but yes.
And are you aware, and I think you may have answered this question, but are you aware of how many people have died in DHS custody since 2010? I recognize that was prior to your time.
I do not have that number, but happy to give it to you.
Let me tell you the number. It's 81 people have died in DHS custody since 2010. Secretary Nielsen, according to a 2018 report by Human Rights Watch, which reviewed the 52 publicly available death reports, almost half of those deaths were linked to substandard care. And Americans are still reeling from the tragic death of Jacqueline Call, who died in Border Patrol custody. As the Secretary of Homeland Security, you oversee all of the facilities in which these negligent deaths have occurred. Can you assure this committee that not a single additional death will result because of negligence on the part of your agency?
I can assure you that I hold the men and women of DHS accountable and that we are always consistently reviewing. We have some of the highest standards in the world, as you know, but our goal is always to take care of those in our custody.
Thank you. And yet, there have been at least 12 deaths under your watch, including a suicide at the Northwest Detention Center, which is just south of my district, and that death is being currently investigated. I heard you say one death is too many. I'm not asking how many you were responsible for. I'm asking you to promise that there won't be another death under your watch.
You have my commitment to ensure that all of our detention centers take good care of those in our care.
And so have you told your facilities that they will no longer receive funding if they don't institute a basic standard of medical care? What have you done to actually ensure medical care in these facilities?
Yeah, so we
I'm sorry, I realize I'm out of time, and I have one more question around.
I'm sorry, that's not going to be allowed. The secretary can answer the last question if she'd like, and then we have to turn to these other folks because she has to leave. And we have votes on the floor, so thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
It's okay.
I will now turn to Ms. Handel.
She didn't answer that question, though.
We're going to
I'm
turn to
trying
Ms.
to let your colleagues speak. Do you
No,
want
I
me to?
know, but you do have the responsibility to answer my question, which
Okay.
was asked before my time was up.
I'm sorry.
So the question was, have you told the facilities that they will no longer receive funding if they do not institute a basic standard of medical care?
I don't see how taking away funding is going to help the situation, but what I have told them is that we will continue to work to make sure that we uphold the strongest standards, that we have the oversight. As you know, we welcome in NGOs all the time, whether it's UNHCR, whether it's the Red Cross, whether it's other part of the UNs, to check. We work with the private sector. We bring in experts. We constantly assess what our detention facilities are like, and we will continue to do that to make sure.
Well, I look forward to receiving a more.
The time has expired. The gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Handel, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Nielsen, for being here. I appreciate your service and that of all of your colleagues at Homeland Security, so thank you. As I'm sure you know, the DiMaia decision invalidated a federal law that defined crimes of violence for the purpose of federal law. And although this definition applies to several areas across the federal code, it does have particular implications when it comes to the removability of criminal illegal aliens. Earlier this year, I introduced H.R. 6691, the Community Safety and Security Act, which would clearly define that term, crime of violence, in the federal criminal code. The bill did pass the House. It's not received Senate consideration yet, but I was wondering if you could comment for us a little bit on how the current situation with this ambiguity of crime of violence affects the removal proceedings and the need for Congress to act to put that clarity into law.
Yes, ma'am. So I'm not familiar with your particular bill, but I completely agree with the issue. We need clear guidance to be able to understand what the congressional direction is on removability. So it's very important for us to have a definition. As you know, there's very confusing court cases. We do our best to comply with them all, but yes, we do need Congress to act.
Okay, specificity matters.
Yes, ma'am.
Secondly, but there's so many people who are watching this hearing from my district, and they have some really basic questions. For example, how many legal points of entry are there across the U.S.-Mexico border?
It's late in the day, and I know, so I would, it's about between 20 and 30.
Okay,
is my
so
recollection.
certainly more than 20.
I believe so, yes.
Okay, great. So when it comes to credible fear, can you just go a little bit more into the difference between when an individual is coming across a border, the different process that takes place if they come to a legal port?
Sure.
Versus trying to cross illegally? And then secondly, giving that first initial statement around credible fear and how that is different from what is required under statutory requirements within a court of law to actually achieve asylum in the U.S.
So if a migrant comes to a port of entry, they haven't broken any laws. So first of all, they're doing it a legal way, and then they make their claim. When they come between the ports of entry, particularly for single adults, they have broken the law. That is a law that we attempt to uphold, so we will refer them for prosecution. With respect to the thresholds for credible fear, it's a significant possibility is the standard, whereas for asylum, it's a reasonable possibility. So it's a slightly different standard. Obviously, the credible fear standard is more lenient.
Okay, great. And then lastly, could you just explain the difference between the queuing process and the hardening of the legal ports, just so everyone understands the difference?
No, I appreciate that. So I think the hardening, I'm not sure what that was referencing, but the hardening in general, what we've done is we have tried to make sure that we funnel the traffic in a safe and orderly way to our officers who can then process the migrants as they come through, or the legal trade and travel. It's not always those seeking asylum, obviously. So the hardening is just to make sure that there isn't a way to get around, or in some cases, what we had seen in the past, unfortunately, were migrants jumping into the vehicle lanes, which could be very dangerous for them. So the hardening is to make it very clear where the passengers and the pedestrians should go, while also allowing that legal trade and travel.
Great, thank you. And I'll just end with this. I'm very, very encouraged by the incredible progress that you've been able to make with Mexico and our other partners in Central and South America to get the care to the individuals who really need it at the earliest point in this whole process versus going through such an arduous trip. So thank you for your effort and your service to our country. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The lady yields back. The chair will recognize Mr. Rankin from Maryland.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Ms. Nielsen. We still have service members engaged in Afghanistan, as you know, and they continue to rely on our wartime allies for their mission, interpreters, translators, cultural advisors, contractors, and so on. And so there are a lot of local nationals who are risking their lives for the success of our mission, and they've been promised safety through the Special Immigrant Visa Program. And yet the number of Special Immigrant Visa recipients dropped from more than 18,000 in fiscal year 2017 to only 10,000 and change in fiscal year 2018. And thus far, we've admitted only 729 of them. Can you explain the significant drop in admissions? And then I'm going to just ask you about a specific case that I've inquired about with my colleague, Representative Denham.
Sure. First, let me just say, because I know you want to use your time well, happy to come give you a brief very specifically. Some of it has to do with the increase in vetting that we do for anyone now coming to the country. And so to some extent, the process takes a bit longer. But as to why that specific drops, sir, happy to come chat with you about it.
Okay, good. Let us definitely pursue that. I sent you a letter back in July with a bipartisan group of members. Representative Denham and I got together to do it, inquiring about the status of the case of Mohammed Kamran, who's an Afghan national who worked for many years as an interpreter for the U.S. Navy, the Army, the USAID, the UN. We sent the letter in July. We finally received a response a couple of weeks ago that said that you could not disclose any information about the status of Mr. Cameron's family, even though we provided a privacy waiver along with our submission to you. We understand he was denied entry for discretionary security reasons, but when his family sought humanitarian parole, they were denied on ostensibly the same basis, including his youngest daughter, who was 4 years old at the time, and it's hard to believe that she constituted any kind of national security threat or risk. Given that his adult brother and sister were granted asylum, how can his family be treated as a national security threat? And can you illuminate what's going on in this case? It's obviously of profound concern to that family and those American personnel who've taken an interest in this case.
Sir, I'm happy to provide you those details. I don't have them in front of me, but happy to follow up very quickly.
Do you know how many other U.S. military interpreters have had their refugee cases denied as a matter of policy discretion?
I do not as a policy discretion. What we do is we do a background check, as you know. Unfortunately, some of them do not pass that. And then in some limited cases, once they receive refugee status, they do something that eliminates or kicks them out of that status. But I can also get you the exact number. Happy to.
I mean, I wonder if you would just close with any thoughts you have about this as a matter of basic fairness and humanitarian principle for the people involved, as well as a matter of national security concern for American military personnel and advisors who are working over there, who depend on interpreters and other people in that kind of situation. And do we really want to be closing the door on the people's refugee applications?
Sir, happy to. We're certainly not closing the door. I think it is important to put it in perspective that last year the United States granted more refugees and asylum status than the next 3 countries combined. So we remain the most humanitarian country. That's certainly my goal, to continue to do that, as well as to support the U.S. military.
I got you, but I mean, my concern, of course, is the dramatic, precipitous, demonstrable drop in the number of admissions of people who are acting on our team in Afghanistan. And I wonder if you would kindly follow up on the specifics of this case of Mr. Kamran, whose case has been given a lot of attention now by both Democrats and Republicans, people across the aisle who are really concerned that he's been given a raw deal. If you would pursue that and then answer more generally about what we're doing to make sure that these people are taken care of.
Absolutely, sir. Happy to do that.
Okay, I look forward to meeting with you and your staff on that. Thanks so much. Mr. Chairman, could I just submit this dear colleague letter that Mr. Denham and I wrote for the record?
Without objection.
Thank you.
Sir, could I just make one request? If I could, just for the record, I'm just re-looking at my notes, and I think, unfortunately, I said that the first time I heard about the 7-year-old's death was December 7th, but that was actually December 8th. So I apologize. I think I just misspoke.
Okay. So noted. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. And Madam Secretary, first I want to say thank you for being here, and thank you for your service. I know what a tough job border security is. Had a great trip down, looked at the entire length of the border in different spots, and so I have a great appreciation for what your men and women at CBP and ICE on the interior are really up against. And I want to ask just a couple things to clarify from earlier. It sounded like there was some issue about whether you could actually build a wall. In fact, I believe the wall's probably under construction today, right?
Yes, sir, it is. With 17 and 18 money, we'll have about 115 miles built.
Right, so a previous Congress has already authorized the construction of the wall.
Yes,
The issue now
2006.
is funding, so put that to bed. I'll also tell you this, in my previous life, I was a law enforcement officer for 41 years. I can't even begin to tell you how many people I put in jail that had children in their custody. And always, those children were separated when the adult criminal was placed in jail. And that child, we would first try to place them with another parent or some family member, responsible family member. But minus that, we were then forced to deliver them to the state of Florida, through the Department of Children and Families, who would then take care of them. And I think the point was made earlier, why would we require you to treat children differently than we do American citizens?
Sorry, I can't answer that, but if I could, what I will say again is we did not have a policy to separate, just as you're describing. If the parent chose to break the law, which there's 3 other ways they can come legally into this country at least, chose to break the law, in some instances we referred them for prosecution because we were applying the law equally. We were not giving a pass because somebody had a child. So because that parent was then going to go to a custodial location, we didn't want to send the child with that adult.
Thank you. And I just want to give you the opportunity to state that clearly again for the record. Also, how important do you think it is for local, state, and federal law enforcement to work together?
It's of utmost importance.
I agree with you. Having been a local law enforcement officer for years, I know the importance of working with state and federal law enforcement officers to protect the not just the hometown, but the homeland. And so the reason I mention that is the 287G program that we ran in my district. We arrested folks and then would run them through the 287G program in our jail. We use the in-jail model, not the police model out in the community. But we arrested thousands of individuals who were found to be illegal immigrants who had already committed a crime within our jurisdiction. And looking at the numbers of those who are arrested under the ERO, who you know have committed crimes, do you have any idea what number, because of sanctuary cities, how many of those individuals are being placed back into the community instead of being turned over to ICE like most good law enforcement communities would do?
I don't, sir, but we believe it's thousands and thousands. I can get you the exact number, unfortunately.
And that creates a very unsafe community for these sanctuary cities. Would you agree?
It does, because it then forces the officers to go into environments that are not controlled. So it puts their safety at risk, but it also puts the rest of the community at risk because we don't know if the person is armed or we don't know if they intend to do harm. The safest way, as you know, is to take that custody in a controlled and safe environment.
Let me close with a question. If I could get you to look into a situation for me.
Please.
The National Insurance Crime Bureau, since 1987, they had been working with CBP, and they would receive export data. This is dealing with stolen vehicles being exported out of the country. That information would be shared with them from CBP, the export data. It would be checked against NCIC, insurance theft records, active lien records, and rental fleet records. And if a vehicle was being exported, was flagged in that Insurance Crime Bureau system, CBP would be notified, and they were able to then interdict that vehicle. And as you know, there's like 800,000 of these vehicles every year. So, however, since CBP's implementation of the automated export system, which made it electronic, the Insurance Crime Bureau has been denied access to the export records and is no longer able to partner with CBP to stop illegally obtained vehicles from being exported. So my question is, what changed? It's authorized. It's still authorized under Title 19, Section 1627. I know there's been some talk about, well, there's some privacy information, but if you look at that information, it's really not that private. And number two, they say, well, all of that information is contained in the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, but it is not. They do not have the same data that the National Insurance Crime Bureau has. So could you look at possibly making that connection again between those two organizations? Because I think that's a great way for a non-government agency to really partner with us to fight crime. As you know, auto theft is not just breaking a window and stealing a car anymore. It's liens, it's all sorts of ways that they're doing this now. Would you mind looking into that and
You
get back
have
with
my
me and let me
commitment,
know
absolutely.
if we can fix that?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. And my time has run out. Yep, will do.
Madam Secretary, thank you very much. I know you've stayed longer than you intended, and I know you have an important commitment, but we got in everybody. I'm sure some were disappointed that you had to votes conflict, but thank you for that. Thank you also for being a great Secretary of Homeland Security. I appreciate your work, and it is evident in how you handled the answers to the question from the members here today. You know what you're doing, you know what you need, you're committed to keeping America safe, and you're committed to having an immigration policy and enforcing an immigration policy that is fair, that is humane, that has respect for the rule of law, but also keeps the tradition of America being a nation of immigrants. So I thank you very much for that, and I wish you the very best. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
With that, this concludes today's hearing, and I thank you to our distinguished witness for attending, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record, and the hearing is adjourned.
D8.